Welcome to our online meeting. Today is Saturday, September 28th, 2024. And as always, big thanks to Miles Jacobs. He's our meeting coordinator, and he makes these meetings happen for us, and he's much appreciated. About an hour before starting this meeting, we had a nice tribute to one of our fallen comrades, Steve Perry, and we took a look at some of his AI cat art and the things we shared back and forth, and also had a discussion about GDF11 and what the future might hold for that. Now, today's presenter is outstanding. He's Albert Donnay, and Albert is an independent consulting toxicologist based in Maryland. And he started studying aging last year when he turned 65. So that seems to be a trigger point for a lot of us where, whoa, things are changing. Tick tock, what are we going to do about it? That's my little commentary. So at Chris Wickman's invitation, he joined Vince Giuliano's weekly Younging chat last September and joined GRG in January. So he is GRG's first toxicologist and the first member to introduce the topic of endogenous carbon monoxide, whose role in aging, disease, and death he frequently comments on. Others may, Albert also may be the only GRG member who takes no medications or supplements for any purpose. And his mission here is to promote more widely accessible methods to reverse aging that don't require any drugs, supplements, diets, or even exercise. So he looks forward to replying to your comments and questions at the end. So please put them in the Q&A tab for the chat. So now I'm going to turn the meeting over to Albert, and Albert, please share your screen. He's going to have a really great presentation.
Thank you very much. I'm delighted to be here. I'm going to make one little adjustment on my screen here. Great. So I'm going to present evidence for a theory that carbon monoxide causes growth, aging, and death in mammals. And I'm going to cover a lot of ground. I'll skip over some parts we don't have to go into much detail on and invite you to look in more detail later at the slides that'll also be available. Darling, how am I going to advance the screen? There we go. I can't advance the screen. There we go. Here's my outline. After some introductions, we'll eventually get to the theory of growth, aging, and death, but I do need to introduce some basics about hormesis, exogenous and endogenous carbon monoxide. And after presenting the theory, I'll show you the lines of evidence that I think disprove the null hypothesis, discuss the implications of the theory, and conclude with 5 free methods for slowing what I'm calling carboxy aging. Won't spend a lot of time here on my background, but I want to point out how far away I'm coming from the fields normally engaged in work on aging. I started in math, then engineering, and now toxicology. And my first work, which I think is still related to what I'm doing now, was inventorying the generation, storage, transport, and disposal of hazardous and radioactive waste in Maryland, and discovered in that process how important it is to know what you're counting and not lose track of it, which is a big problem with carbon monoxide research. Since 1994, I've directed a nonprofit called MCS Referral and Resources that helps people with multiple chemical sensitivity disorders. That is a photo there of the Edgar Allan Poe actor with whom I did a historic grand rounds about Poe's illness and death at the National Library of Medicine, and that really kicked off my interest in carbon monoxide and led to the discovery of a syndrome I've named multisensory sensitivity, or Musis syndrome, which is Poe described in some of his famous tales like the Telltale Heart and the Fall of the House of Usher affect not just your sense of smell, but all of your senses. Poe said in Telltale Heart, "Have I not told you what you mistake for madness is but over acuteness of the senses?" And I was able to show that Poe was poisoned by carbon monoxide from gaslight in homes he lived in cities that had gaslight. He never suffered or wrote about these problems when he lived in cities that didn't have gaslight. That's where I'm coming from. Since 1999, I've also been an independent consultant, doing business as Donnay Toxicology, specializing in carbon monoxide. I've created some protocols and products, try to move things forward. I have some patents. Most importantly, for today's discussion, I compiled and curate over 2,200 collections of references on PubMed about carbon monoxide related topics. And think of it as a forest of dots. And there are a lot of different ways to make use of these collections, and you'll see what I try to do with them today to connect some of these dots. And in the last year, as Johnny mentioned, I'm looking now at what's the possible role of CO in growth, aging, and death, and excited to find, based on my work on CO, that there are some legal methods that can slow aging without any diet, supplements, drugs, devices, or exercise, or at least that's my claim. Conflicts of interest, I have basically my patents, but I don't earn any income from them, and my clients, I'm not representing any of them. I should emphasize also, I'm not representing any of the literature I discuss, and any errors in that are on the backs of the authors. I'm assuming everything I find on PubMed is correct, but we know that's not true. Most importantly, because I'm not a physician, I'm not giving anybody medical advice today. I'm giving you toxicology information. I want to thank Chris again for introducing me to Vince's group and the Johnny's group, and both of these groups for welcoming me. Brandon Ames, who's on the phone, I have to thank for making a slide on the periodic table and checking many of the others, and my wife Cynthia for editing all the other ones. When you see italics, that's from Claude.ai. Responding to a prompt, and I'm not taking responsibility for what Claude says either. So let's start by looking at monotonic versus hormetic responses. Monotonic means ever increasing in one direction or the other, depending what you put on the y-axis. It might be going up to show harm or down to show benefit, but these monotonic agents always just go in one direction, and the optimal dose, the optimal healthy dose, is always zero. In contrast, a hormetic agent is U-shaped or N-shaped if you turn it upside down, depending again on what's on the y-axis. And here, as the dose increases, you see there's a sweet spot in the middle. And there are actually many points at which two different doses can produce the same outcome. A low dose and a high dose produce the same result on the y-axis. And critically, in most hormetic discussion, the people are interested in that sweet spot at the bottom and don't look too far to the left. But as you'll see today, you really need to look at this curve all the way down to zero. Here's some examples. The monotonic ones are usually the true poisons, because zero is the most beneficial dose of mercury, lead, alcohol, etc. While hormetic agents include all the vital substances where it would be fatal if the dose were zero. Vitamins, minerals, oxygen, vita-gases, as we now call them, not just CO, but nitric oxide, hydrogen sulfide, even carbon dioxide, which many people think is just a waste gas, is critical to our health. So now turning to carbon monoxide, I want to start by showing you that even EPA cares about the health of older adults, although it's getting a little out of date. 15 years ago, they cared about the health of older adults and their caregivers in the context of CO poisoning. And the reason on the right in italics is very important. They're recognizing they're at risk because of pre-existing conditions, such as chronic heart disease, anemia, or respiratory problems that make them more susceptible. They don't make any connection between endogenous and exogenous, but as we'll see in this presentation, these are the same disorders that carbon monoxide poisoning can cause or worsen when it's inhaled or when it's produced endogenously. I highlighted in yellow here that it's listed as the most common cause of poisoning deaths in the US, but the numbers underneath are much lower than accurate. And the CDC has published papers based on real data that say over 1,000 people die per year. And the number who visit emergency rooms is not 15,000 annually, it's over 220,000. So this is a huge burden on US healthcare at the level it's recognized, but many more cases are not. I've tried to promote awareness of CO poisoning with this poster. All of the images and the text have hyperlinks to take you to PubMed collections of references that show how carbon monoxide is released by the sources and the images around the outside here, and can either cause or worsen the conditions you see in the middle. I've covered up the ones on the right with the asterisks that relate to internal poisoning. We'll talk about them later. Before I leave this screen, which I think most of you are pretty familiar with these types of sources, I want to highlight the two at the far left that surprise most people and are actually among the highest level of CO you can be exposed to, and if you're a non-smoker. The top right shows somebody smelling roasted coffee. That exposes you to over 2,000 parts per million, according to the highest level I can get on my instrument. And the government says anything over 1,200 is immediately dangerous to life and health, so don't spend a lot of time smelling it. And the DLCO test in the lower right is often given in pulmonary labs without informed consent, telling people, don't worry, it's just 0.3% carbon monoxide, but that's actually 3,000 parts per million. And that test needs to be repeated up to 6 times. So these types of exposures are not well recognized. The others on the other pictures are more so, and critically, any of them, even one of them, is enough to cause the conditions here on the inside. And I've put 32 on this poster and tell my clients if they have 9 or more to suspect CO poisoning. They may have them for weeks or months or even years after they survive their poisoning. As they gradually fade away, it takes a very long time to recover often from a CO poisoning hangover. This is just the tip of the iceberg, however, because in the CO literature in my collections, there's evidence of over 190 conditions that have been caused by high-level external exposure. I'm obviously not going to go through the list. The point is to show you it's a long list. And there are many disorders on here that are disorders of aging, including heart disease and stroke, Parkinsonism, and Alzheimer's. With so many possible conditions that CO can cause, you might wonder how they're all tested. Unfortunately, the CDC recommends just 2 of these 3 methods. They don't give any rational reason to exclude the third one with the X. They just don't even address it. But it's usually measured by blood in the top right there, or with a pulse CO oximeter on your finger that can distinguish CO and oxygen. The breath CO analyzer in the bottom, though, is the least expensive and most accurate. These are just the tip of the iceberg. Again, however, as the literature shows, again, over 190, 189 today, abnormal signs have been reported. 40 of these, the ones in bold italics, are directly observable. You can see if somebody is bleeding from their orifices, or if they are in a coma or suffering convulsions, right? Or have skin rashes and blisters. Others require a test, and all the ones that have blood in front of them in the first column, of course, you would need a blood test, but you can see there's a good several dozen biomarkers that can be tested in blood to help with a differential diagnosis of whether or not somebody has a high level CO poisoning. And here's a bit more information about the objective signs. I always like showing what's important about Poe. It's not just that he was poisoned and taught us important information about all the symptoms in his tales. He also left us this iconic image, his telltale face, as I now call it, which many people poisoned by CO badly today also have. Either the right or the left eye can be lower than the other, and the mouth is pulled up underneath. And this is not known to be caused by any other condition except possibly facial surgeries or strokes. Apparently the graphic failed on this one. I was going to show you a graph of post-mortem carboxyhemoglobin levels measured by coroners and reported in studies as scatter plots on a graph, where you can see what range of carboxyhemoglobin people had when they died, either of CO poisoning in high levels, that's usually only diagnosed if it's over 10%, but also in the study I was going to show you here at low levels, all the way down to less than 1% in people who died of other causes that were considered not CO poisoning, like heart disease. And in that group, the highest level was about 3%. It left a gap between 3 and 10, where only one person died. There were many cases below 3 and above 10, but it seemed to be, as a hormetic curve would suggest, a hormetic agent would have a sweet spot in the middle where there were better health effects than in either end. And I'm just pointing out, if I had the slide, I'm sorry I don't. Imagine it if you will. There's a bunch of dots at the bottom and a bunch of dots at the top, and there's this gap in the middle. So that's why I have confidence in concluding exogenous CO as hormetic. There are also a great many environmental epidemiology studies of living people who are studied over 8-hour averages over several days to see if there are changes in how many report to emergency departments or unfortunately die from various conditions when outdoor levels of CO go up just a few parts per million over background levels that also now are very low. And these studies show that all the same conditions we just looked at that can be caused by high level CO exposure can also be caused by these chronic low level exposures from outdoor air that of course is always no less than your indoor air because they're moving back and forth all the time. What's important here is that these are disorders that for the most part in clinical medicine, physicians don't recognize that the low exposure is contributing. They recognize the high level in many cases, but not the low level. Low level exposure also increases mortality. Elderly men are at highest risk for almost all these disorders. Sorry, the causes of death that have been reported are shown here, and the red ones are also on that list of the high level exposures. These are causes of death within 0 to 7 days of the person being exposed to the low CO in their environment. But you see there's several more in black that show there are more causes of death identified now for low level CO poisoning than for high level. This is a mortality study, one of the largest in the world, recently done in 2021, shows you the results of 18 countries, and overall at the bottom, the x-axis at the bottom shows you what percentage change there is in daily all-cause mortality in these 337 cities when carbon monoxide goes up 1 milligram per cubic meter, which is just about a part per million. And you see most of them, in fact, the overall average down there at the bottom are around plus 1% increase in mortality for every 1 ppm increase in CO. And some are as high as 3% increase. That's in South Korea. There's only 2 countries that had lower risks when it went up. The UK was right about 0, but Taiwan was down about minus 0.8. The dashed line and the vertical line represent 0. And if these confidence intervals cross the dashed line, that result is considered to not be statistically significant. So both Taiwan and UK really shouldn't count. Some of the positive ones shouldn't count, but the main message is there's a lot of positive ones here that don't cross the 0 line and that show us all countries of the world need to be worried about the effects of these very low exposures. This shows you it's carbon monoxide even more than NOx and particulate matter that's causing these deaths. Over, in this case, the x-axis is a 30-day lag, but the CO peak and the others as well is occurring within the first 10 days after the exposure. And you can see on the y-axis the percent change in death rate is larger for CO than the others. Here's another one showing.
Albert,
Yeah,
Albert, do you want us to hold all questions until the end?
yes, please. Let me race through this and remember what we're talking about, or write a note and we'll come back. The glioblastoma slide here, again, shows you very small levels of ambient CO, just going from half a ppm to 2 ppm is raising the relative death rate for people with glioblastoma by 50%. Here's one on recovery after hip fracture surgery over a year. And these CO levels are really small, tiny differences. The blue line is your cumulative incidence of death in that year if you were exposed in your environment to less than 0.47. The brown in the middle, 0.47 to 0.61, and the green over 0.61. These are extremely low levels of CO, and yet they're having extremely large effect sizes at p less than 0.001. Why do I think this is happening? I believe it's explained by this slide, which shows how carbon monoxide levels in air have changed over the last 50 years since EPA adopted its clean air policy in the early 70s that required catalytic converters on all cars with the explicit goal of lowering carbon monoxide in air to lower the carbon monoxide level in people's blood. They thought it should be below 2%. And on the left, you can see at that time in 1979, when they were just getting started, these show the number of major US cities that were at different levels of CO, and very few were down there at the bottom. The average was around 9. The highest cities were over 18. And people who lived in these cities critically, this is the level that, not just that they inhaled every day, but it was the baseline that they exhaled. You can't exhale less usually than the environment you're habituated to. And now on the right, all these 25 years, or how many years later? 50, almost since they started. The CO level in the US is less than 3 ppm everywhere. Most US cities less than 1. Healthy now non-smokers are both inhaling and exhaling less than 3. And what that's done is it's, for the whole country, taken away just the variation, but also the relative habituation that even non-smokers used to have, the higher levels of CO. When CO is now just 1 ppm or less, that's all non-smokers are habituated to. And so any minor variation there can have a large effect on them because they're not used to it. Whereas back in the 70s, you couldn't find a US city with 1 or 2 ppm in it, and nobody would be sensitive to levels below the number they were already habituated to. Now let's turn to endogenous CO poisoning. It means from within. And now I'll show you the asterisks as I had covered up before. Endogenous CO poisoning, although it comes from within, this awareness poster is trying to make the point that it can be provoked from without. The items on the right side here that are provoking internal endogenous CO poisoning, causing your body to make more when you're exposed to them, are all medical or healthcare related products. At the top, drugs, supplements, and vaccines. Why they can boost your CO, X-rays can do it, and ultrasounds, hyperbaric chambers and ventilators, and menstrual products, not because they cause you to make more, but because they restrict how much you can excrete, and in that way cause your endogenous CO level to go up more. But this is just to the tip of the iceberg again of the causes. This list isn't so long, but it's bigger and bolder because these are a whole lot more important. Millions of people in total are exposed to these procedures every year without informed consent, telling them that they're going to raise their CO level when they have it done. And there's no measurement before, during, or after to see how high the CO went, and no follow-up. We've learned in COVID, unfortunately, how bad this can be. And I'll show you a slide here. This is from a COVID ICU. People were on oxygen, and the death rate increased 6-fold there in the middle in red when the maximum carboxyhemoglobin was just over 3%. It increased 4-fold when the mean was over 2% there on the right. So these are really significant increases. The image on the left shows you the actual COHB changes in each individual, and I underlined the red line. Actually, I added the red line to show you the 2% warning level from both the CDC and the EPA. That's where they are saying we should be below, and many people came to the hospital with a higher level, but by day 5, you can see most of them are going up, and it predicted whether they would live or die. So where does this endogenous CO come from? This simplifies as best I can the pathways, inputs and outputs. At the top, it's triggered by stressors of almost all kinds. Emphasize we're looking at what's called the hemoxygenase 1 pathway. The box at the top shows you there's another one called hemoxygenase 2 that's located mostly in your blood vessel lining, and it involves the same inputs and outputs, but it's not susceptible to stressors of all kinds or most kinds the way hemoxygenase is. And it's only hemoxygenase that's known as the universal stress enzyme. Physical, mental stressors, infectious stressors, injuries, chemicals, drugs, radiation, heat, light, all can turn up this pathway very quickly. And either it will directly respond to the activity, or it will start a cascade of more HO1 production, begins with the HEMOX1 gene, and ends up with more protein, and usually, but not always, also more activity. What the protein does is catalyzed by NADPH and a CP450 reductase complex, plus critically 3 oxygen molecules. It takes on the destruction of any heme protein. In blood, that's likely to be hemoglobin, but beyond your blood, you have many others. I asterisk some there on the bottom: hemoglobin, myoglobin, haptoglobin. Claude gave me an even longer list, but it got cut off of about 15 different heme proteins that we should be worried about, including all of our cytochromes, for example, which play a critical role in our mitochondrial function. So that's the input side: oxygen, a heme protein, and NADPH. And HO1 will then relatively quickly reduce this in 3 steps to a biliverdin molecule, which is reversibly reduced to bilirubin, to 1 or 2 carbon monoxides, 2 of them if the heme protein already had a carbon monoxide bound to it. Carboxyhemoglobin has CO bound to it, and if that's broken down, the CO on the outside is released while a new one is created from the inside. Ferrous iron is released, a toxic form of iron that it has to be converted to ferritin to be safe for us to store and reuse to make more heme proteins. And that's I think the main point of this pathway is to recycle this iron, because we're not making more iron. We're just making more carbon monoxide for every iron we make. 3 water molecules come out of this pathway, and a lot of heat comes out of this pathway. The carbon monoxide can look red in your tissues. So I say this is the pathway that makes you red, hot, and wet. And if you see red, hot, and wet, like somebody who spent too much time sunbathing, that's an indication that their skin is red from carbon monoxide, and their temperature and sweat levels are up because of the same pathway. The acronym at the bottom is my first attempt, with Brent's help, to come up with a way to remember all of this. I'd like to pronounce it for you, because once I pronounce it, I think you'll remember it forever. You might have even heard some of it before. O, ho, 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 bye, bye, Coco Feffy. So with that behind us, if you look this up in a textbook or online, you'll see diagrams more like those on the left rather than the right, which is my attempt to fill in all the missing blanks. I'm still working on this. I'm still missing pieces and probably have mistakes, so don't rely on it. But just to show you, there's a lot more to this pathway than the usual cartoons. And one thing that's typically left out that I think is super important is that oxygen coming in at the top and the water coming out with the heat at the bottom. And I should add one more thing that's not coming out of this pathway. This is a pathway that's converting oxygen to water, heat, and carbon monoxide without any production of carbon dioxide. So very unlike the Krebs cycle. Some other differences to highlight here. I won't go through all the details in hemoxygenase 1 and 2, but I want you to think of them like in inducible nitric oxide synthase and endothelial nitric oxide synthase, if you're familiar with those proteins and how they affect the production of nitric oxide. Just in the same way, HO1 is inducible by a great many things, and the endothelial HO2, which is actually in the endothelial layer, is not. Unfortunately, the hemoxygenase literature is way too biased towards research on HO1, and there's less than 1,000 references now on HO2, whereas the NOS literature is better balanced. I'm hoping there'll be more research done on HO2 in the future as we learn of its importance in women's health, because although it's not responding to most inducers the way HO1 does, it does vary with the menstrual cycle and in response to a few very potent inducers. Critically, both are located in liver, kidney, spleen, and lungs, where we have a high level of heme proteins, and there's a lot to break down and turn over. But only HO2 is high in those organs that have a low level of heme proteins and that don't really want a whole lot of CO to build up in them because it would be so toxic, your brain, testes, ovaries, and heart. And one last thing I'll mention here is that there is a genetic component. People with more GT repeats in the HEMOX1 gene, which dark-skinned people born in Africa are the only people on Earth to have. Every other continent of peopled by humans ended up having an opposite type of risk. In Africa, the risk is to have a high number of GT repeats, which dampens their immune response to threats and protects them against malaria and beta thalassemia. But everybody else has a lower GTN risk, which boosts and accelerates their response to stress. And that, of course, turned out to be quite bad for COVID, which people in Africa had the highest survival rate of, and people in North America did very poorly with. Won't spend a lot of time on these functions about CO that are considered positive. If you go to the literature, the green ones are mostly what you'll read about. I'm interested in the negatives and the red, which are occurring in the outer ranges of the hormetic curve. The green effects are well documented within the extremes of too much and too little CO and are clearly driving a lot of interest. But in many of those papers, if you dive into them, you'll see they are not considering at all what the other negative consequences might be of the byproducts they're inducing. They focus often on the biliverdin, more than the carbon monoxide, because both of those are potent antioxidants. I should mention that if you have too much bilirubin, our body has a pathway through conjugated bile to get rid of it. Conjugated bilirubin, rather, excreted in bile. And if we have too much iron, we get so sick quickly, we're usually going to see a doctor in an emergency room pretty quickly, and they will treat that with a phlebotomy where they draw blood to lower the level of iron in your blood. But no such precautions or treatments are done for carbon monoxide, even though it's produced in the same reactions. This shows you how much we can produce. It was done 15 years ago now by an EPA staffer who was unable to get the EPA interested in pursuing it. She showed here in a review the different rates in milliliters per minute of how much CO we make all the time. The green ranges at the top are for healthy normals, adult males, females at the two ends of their menstrual cycle. In the progesterone phase, just before their period, they're making about a third more per minute than men. And in the estrogen phase, about a third less. In pregnancy, they make even more, while the fetus makes the least of all. Postpartum, they change quickly from a relatively high 24 hours down to lower postpartum. And these other conditions are more serious ICU-like problems, hemolytic anemias, sepsis, cardiac disease. And you can see they can go as much as 5 times higher than the normal range. And in addition to the other modulators I mentioned, it also is going to vary with any changes in air temperature, altitude, light level, time of day. Unless you're measuring this, you really have no idea what it's going to be doing. This is from a team at Stanford that measures postmortem levels. The blue levels show the concentration in picomoles per milligram of CO found after people died of other causes, while the red range on the right repeats the blue, but not on a much larger scale now. The blue almost disappears. The red is the levels they found in people who died of acute CO poisoning. And you see they can average as high as 49-fold higher in the organs with the most binding capacity, the lung, the spleen, the blood. The average was 35-fold higher, but fat only went up five-fold because there's not a lot of heme proteins in fat to hold heme, so it holds CO rather, it can't bind it. And I want to point out one last thing in here, which is that the heart, which is often thought of as the most sensitive organ here, was nevertheless able to increase its CO load 12-fold. And that seems to me to be a huge amount. This happened very quickly to people, and I'm concerned now about how much CO we can accumulate over our lifetimes at a low level before it may kill us in the same hypoxic way. One last slide about your endogenous hemoxygenase levels over your lifetime. The x-axis here are people ages 3 to 83, I believe it was, who died of one reason or another. They autopsied their brains looking for hemoxygenase, and they found these continuously increasing levels in both the paroccipital lobe and the hippocampus. Ferritin, another byproduct, was also high in the paroccipital lobe there on the right, but at the far right, it wasn't high in the hippocampus because ferritin's a solid and it can't easily move the way carbon monoxide gas can. And I believe that's how the gas got into so many regions of the brain when the ferritin basically stayed where it was produced. I also want to look at the levels of CO in breath to show you these also correlate with breath and at very low levels. Here we're not inhaling, we're not looking at what people are inhaling, we're looking at what people are exhaling. And this is a cumulative incidence over 10 years on the x-axis of cardiovascular death, with CO levels in blue that were below 4, in red 4 to 5, in green over 5. Remember, the US is now under 1 or 2 everywhere all the time. And lastly, in this section, I want to mention Levitt's breath test for red blood cell lifespan, because this critically links our body's breath CO level to the lifespan of our red blood cells, which is where 70% of our carbon monoxide is coming from. I mentioned there are other heme proteins like cytochromes beyond blood. They provide another 30%. But what Levitt did was to improve on gold standard methods back then that required actually monitoring people's health and blood for as long as the lifespan might last with a radio-labeled blood tag. He figured out a way to do this in just a few minutes by measuring their hemoglobin level and their breath carbon monoxide level. He reduced it to that short formula. And this shows you the relative ranges. The longer horizontal line on the left for healthy controls is about 125 days. The rheumatoid arthritis people are at about 90 days average. Osteoarthritis looks pretty good. It's even higher than the healthy controls, about 129 days. But the anemic and chronically ill people are down there below 90. And the literature shows people can have these red blood cell lifespans as low as 10 days or less. They're going to die very quickly in an ICU at that rate. And at the high end, the highest reported is 216 days. Adverse conditions that correlate with abnormally high endogenous HO1 and CO both are shown here. The red ones, again, are on that exogenous list we started with, the really long one. This shows you there's a lot of overlap, as we would expect, between being exposed to high-level external CO and high-level internal CO. The same syndromes are coming up, and many of them, again, disorders of aging and death, like cardiac MI, and also Parkinson's, I believe, is still on this list. Yes, and highlighted, and stroke, as well as many diseases in black that aren't recognized in acute CO poisoning, but are recognized in the endogenous literature. I should also mention, I was going to add an asterisk for those that flare up in the week before menses and subside after. But that was really for the men's benefit because the women already know which diseases flare up in menses. The point is that they might all be CO related because that's when your CO level is going up most sharply. This shows at the other end of the curve, even with endogenous CO, there's also a low end where conditions are correlated with having too little hemoxygenase, or I should say a low level. We assume it's too little because when they're given more, they improve. The conditions shown here with a pound symbol are reported to get better when you give more carbon monoxide or boost their HO1 level. The good news here is that it's a shorter list. There's not a lot of overlap as we would expect with syndromes of high CO exposure, and it does confirm that this entire paradigm is somewhat hermetic. We've got disorders and deaths occurring at both ends of a very broad spectrum. This is data from an ECMO clinic where they are treating people's blood outside their body with ARDS, patients who had ARDS, and this showed that if they were going to survive that experience in an ICU, they needed to have carboxyhemoglobin somewhere between 3 and 4%. If they were much higher or lower, their hazard ratio for death went way up at both ends. And this shows you how tight that window can be in some conditions. There's a lot of work to do to see what this curve looks like for other conditions. The critical differences between men and women, just briefly, before puberty, the body size, blood volumes, hemoglobins are the same, but yet women do, I should say females at that age, do have a shorter red blood cell lifespan and are more quickly
Did the meeting freeze?
Just Albert.
Anyone?
Just Albert.
Okay.
So I know occasionally there are connectivity issues. I don't know if that's going through with him or not. I will try to see if I can text him. I don't know. Looks like we lost him.
Well, he is now seems to be out of the meeting. We can expect he'll rejoin and roll
Yep.
along. Very
I'm
informative.
going to give him a call. Yeah.
I was just going to say that one thing he had that was negative at the very beginning was alcohol, and I wouldn't see surprised at that by a lot of alcohol, but I thought for a small amount of alcohol, occasional bit of red wine or something, there had been some good publications for. So a bit of alcohol was good for you. It was hormetic, really. No alcohol at all was worse than a little bit. And then after that, it went up in terms of harm.
I'll be the test case.
Yeah. So, Paul, we've had this discussion with Albert in our weekly group with Vince Giuliano. There appears to be, things working against each other. So the alcohol is probably raising your CO, but through other pathways, the alcohol is probably providing some offsetting benefit. And so the question is, what's the right balance?
Everything is pro-aging. You get in your car to drive to your age management physician, you're taking a risk. So it's a careful balance.
Yeah, and I did reach Albert, and he's trying to reconnect. He doesn't know what happened.
Just for a moment, I want to, Chris, you said that Albert has made these claims in a group sponsored by Vince Giuliano. Vince Giuliano does not hold to these views.
No, I'm not
He
implying that.
Vince Giuliano thinks this perspective is can be harmful to people who aren't really familiar with the literature. Just to be clear about that, okay?
Yeah, thanks. I'm not implying that Vince agrees. They're just in the forum, we have challenged Albert on some of these things.
He
And
is profoundly out of touch with the literature in major ways. He is on record as saying that hyperbaric oxygen therapy.
Steve, please, could we wait until the end when Albert is here to reply? Yeah.
Thank you. I apologize for losing my connection. It said connecting, and I realized I had been cut off. May I continue?
Yeah. No apology necessary.
Tell me when you see the last slide that I lost you at. Did you see this one?
Well, are you sharing your screen?
Oh, are we on me?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
It was
Go ahead,
the
Brent.
one with critical differences, male and female at different ages.
Okay. Okay, sharing. Screen sharing.
Okay, so somewhere around an hour around 45 minutes, 50 minutes, it cut out. I will be able to edit things out too. So for the best of your ability, please try to pick up where you think it stopped.
Thank you very much. And I do apologize again. Can you all see my screen now?
It's all good.
So yes, if I were at the differences between men and women, critically,
you're now on the screen that we lost you.
Is that good? Good. So I mentioned that before puberty, males and females are very similar in body size, hemoglobin, blood volume, but nevertheless, females are growing faster, as evidenced by their lower red blood cell lifespan. They're turning over faster. They have a higher body temperature. And as we know, they enter puberty faster because presumably they were growing faster. But between 10 and 20, men catch up and exceed them and end up at 20 with relatively higher CO levels that they have the rest of their lives because they have a larger blood volume, more red blood cells per liter, and more hemoglobin per red blood cell. I should say that there's about 250 to 270 million hemoglobin in each red blood cell. So when they split open and spill out at the end of the red blood cell life, there's quickly a quarter billion hemoglobin. They break into pairs called dimers of their 4 chains, and then there's a 500 million of them, and they can break again, and you end up at the end of this process with 1 billion heme chains that need to be broken down and scavenged, and that will release 1 billion molecules of iron and 1 billion molecules of carbon monoxide, plus whatever was already bound to it. So that's a lot per red blood cell. Over the lifetime, the main change is that women have a relatively steady state, both through their menstrual years and even after in their breath as they get older, making about the same amount of CO all the way, while men, after they pass andropause, start to decline and decline for decades in terms of how much CO they can produce. And this is thought to contribute to their weaker stress response as they age. Men, unlike women, have a different genetic profile usually, where they are more likely to pick up an epigenetic change in the number of GT repeats in the HEMOX1 gene. And the more of those repeats you have, which is also acquired by smoking, the less responsive your stress pathway is going to be. Women, even though their menstrual cycle stops, are more responsive to stress through the rest of their life. So lastly, I want to point out this curve that got me very interested in why women are doing better. It's survival curves of Olympians who perform different sports. And it shows you on the bottom, the women are living longer. And critically, during their menstrual years, there's almost no survival risk at all. It really begins after their menstrual years conclude. The green line shows that the 100-meter runner had a higher risk than the blue line, the high jumpers, who presumably were ventilating better and able to exhale more CO, not just in their competition, but in all of their training. And I also mentioned for women this observation about the menstrual cycle, which is that it may be the rise and fall in carbon monoxide that's driving the growth, aging, and sloughing of the endometrial layer during the cycles, as well as the placenta during pregnancy. And these two yellow lines show the same point of the cycle, but on the left, how it's normally portrayed, where the cycle starts at day 1 and ends at day 28 or so. I rearranged that to put the end of the cycle in the middle of the graph to illustrate there on the bottom how sharply carbon monoxide goes up and then comes down again around menses, because it's coming from the breakdown of the endometrial layer, which shown here on the left is growing throughout the cycle until at the very end, peak, and it's sloughed off. This is very similar to what happens in a sunburn when the old layer sloughs off and the new skin grows underneath. And HOCO has also been reported to modulate that. So to summarize, just kidding, I'm not going to say any more about it. I brought you a long way. Let's get to the theory. I was looking for a theory to answer these questions about aging. I mentioned I'm curious why women have longer glowing. I know that men's ears grow faster, however, so what's with that? Why do women have lower risk of heart disease and stroke before menopause, but it rises after? What rather do these longest lived mammals have in common that don't seem to have any relationship to each other? Mole rats, bats, bowhead whales, right? Greenland sharks, and even some humans are living much longer than normal. And so are some professions. It turns out academic professors live the longest and transit workers live the shortest compared to others born the same year. And finally, I'm curious, why did lifespan increase with latitude and altitude and as mean annual temperature decreases? I'm not talking about living at the North or South Pole, but within reasonable limits, people who are living at, say, 45 to 60 degrees latitude having longer lifespans than people who are living at 0 to 10. The observations that led me to the theory, looking at those longest lived animals, I'm thinking they have less daily exposure to major hemoxygenase stressors, so they make less CO. Many of them live in darkness or deep underwater, so they're not exposed to sunlight as much, if at all. The tortoise under its shell, for instance, and they're also not exposed to high temperatures, which is the main inducer of hemoxygenase. They also have more efficient means of excreting carbon monoxide. Bats flying, for instance, are hyperventilating, and that's a very efficient way to get rid of the CO they've accumulated at other times. They also, as a result of the first two, are just accumulating less CO every year in their organs and tissues. That gives them a slower growth rate than the shorter-lived mammals, and they have a longer red blood cell lifespan. When there are populations of these animals that live in different climates, the ones who are living in the colder climate at the higher latitude or altitude or the greater depth in the ocean are living longer than the other ones. And I also observed with regard to carbon monoxide that both exogenous and endogenous CO are contributing to what we call the senescence of red blood cells. But CO can just as easily go into any other type of cell. And people who study CO poisoning don't pay much attention to that. But in all these other cells, of course, our mitochondria and many other organelles that CO can poison if it gets in there, because it has a greater affinity for all heme proteins, not just hemoglobin in blood, but every other heme protein will preferentially bind carbon monoxide. And after it's done so, oxygen can't displace that. You'd need some other extraordinary means to get it off. The more CO binds to these heme proteins, the more the cell's oxygen capacity is decreasing, just like filling a glass with water and leaving less room at the top for air. And what I want to call it, CO senescence markers are increasing with it. So finally, the theory, simply that CO from exogenous and endogenous sources, HO1, HO2, and others, causes growth, aging, and death in mammals, and that it does so in the hormetic fashion we've been talking about, so that optimal levels of exposure, production, and accumulation are not zero, but somewhere between lower and higher levels. The null hypothesis is the statement scientists come up with to actually test the hypothesis by disproving the opposite. So this statement should be made as close to the direct opposite of H1 as possible. Please argue with me if you think I didn't make an appropriate statement, but I came up with CO from exogenous and endogenous sources does not cause growth, aging, and death in mammals. And if either does, the effects are not hormetic. So how do we prove that? Well, we go looking for evidence that CO doesn't cause these things. First, went looking for other theories that might already have gotten there. And I didn't find any that mentioned carbon monoxide, but I heard Aubrey's debate earlier this year and was really impressed by how clear he was about there being two rates of aging, through which some toxic agent of aging was accumulating, but one in a basal constitutive rate, a steady rate, and the other much more responsive to ambient conditions and stresses, so not a steady rate at all. And I asked Claude.ai to tell me who else has similar ideas. This is the list it came up with. I didn't check it. I hope it's right. These people are all alive, and I do hope they're not misrepresented in their views. But please, if you know of others, let me know who thinking in the same lines. Here was my first attempt to do the literature search to see what I could find, overlapping the references on PubMed for the term aging and either heme oxygenase or its three primary byproducts, carbon monoxide, the biliverdin or bilirubin that it ends up going to, and either ferrocyan or ferritin. I found quite a few articles on aging in these topics, right? Several hundred, but in their overlap in the middle, there were just 4 papers that mentioned all of these terms. And I was already aware of 3 of them. That wasn't anything new from carbon monoxide poisoning perspective. So I was pretty disappointed and realized I would need to do a more structured type of literature review. And I selected what I thought was a pretty broad number of search terms for broad areas of potential overlap in biomarkers of aging and death. On 26 terms, I'll show you in a second. Disorders of human aging, stages of human growth, heme proteins, genesis and growth of cells and tissues, and senescence and death of cells and tissues. I figured if carbon monoxide is intimately involved in this, there should be some literature about it beyond just what I had seen in carbon monoxide poisoning articles, which you see here. The larger carbon monoxide poisoning literature has thousands more references on these topics. And so I wondered, are all of these relevant? The heme oxygenase literature I compared it with is also enormous. I could never get through that. I can barely keep up with the CO poisoning literature. So to zoom in on what I think would be most relevant, I made my final search for heme oxygenase and carbon monoxide both in the same paper, as well as all these terms over here on the left. And that brought it down to some manageable numbers, still very impressive, with almost twice as many as any other category devoted to biomarkers of aging and death. So I'll now show you very quickly what that top level analysis looks like and these other terms, just to highlight, A, there's a lot of them, and B, they're not clustered in any one condition. They're widely scattered throughout all of this terminology, which suggests to me researchers are widely incorporating a deep look at these issues, and they're not just dismissing them. They wouldn't be so widely referenced if they were just dismissed. This shows you at the top level of biomarkers, the ones that were reported in over 1,000 papers at least for either all carbon monoxide in brown at the top. The red ones are the carbon monoxide poisoning. The light blue is the hemoxygenase. And I highlighted in dark blue the ones we're really interested in, the HO and CO refs. Here you can actually see them. On other ones, say when we get down here below 1,000 refs, these are still biomarkers, but with fewer references relating them. Dark blue, except ferritin, which is really high, as expected, are quite low and almost impossible to even see here. They're there, I'll show you later, but there's not that many. Most of the work has been focused on either a top-level discussion by a paper that mentioned CO or a top-level discussion by a paper that mentioned hemoxygenase, and they didn't really get into the weeds and the mechanisms. Here's a similar analysis for disorders of aging and death that shorten our health span and lifespan, and you see cancer, surprisingly, is very highly listed among the carbon monoxide references and the HO both, but not at all hardly in their overlap. Down below, there's quite a few again on CO poisoning, but the dark blue we're interested in not so much yet. This is the ones that look at different phases of life and humans, and I'm surprised that the puberty or teenager there at the bottom, nobody really wants to study them. You see how much work is being done on the elderly and how much greater risk they are for CO poisoning. The brown line shows you that they are, actually, I misread that. There's only about 250 to 300 for them, but more for children and babies and pregnant women, over 1,000 each. I apologize for confusing that. We're worried about them mostly because they are most likely to suffer permanent damage from CO poisoning. Here are the key protein terms I searched for, and the ones at the bottom you see are barely in the literature yet, but I believe will be more important in the future, especially androglobin, which is only found in male testes and really must play an important role there. And obviously at the top, carboxyhemoglobin is important to CO, but I was stunned to see there's more papers on cytochromes than there are, and carbon monoxide poisoning than there are on carboxyhemoglobin. And we're coming to the end of this list. Now, these are the ones that discuss abnormal growth or normal. And interestingly, CO is associated both with wound healing that works out appropriately and with improper growth. You see the top category here is papers on cancer and carcinogenesis. Bren and I have been doing a research project seeing that, unfortunately, almost all of the cancers that have been studied for their HO pathways are accelerated and grow more when exposed to CO, and all of the carcinogens that have been studied for this in the IARC database are shown to induce the HO pathway. So there's a clear connection between carcinogens boosting CO and then CO overgrowing tissue to create cancers. And lastly, here are types of aging, cell aging and death, the opposite of the cell growth. And here, there's almost nothing on CO poisoning, right? Barely one or two articles on neuronal death and apoptosis. But for the most part, these silos haven't overlapped yet, although there's some huge amount at the top level in apoptosis and cell death. There's no connection yet to CO poisoning. Here are those actual terms that I was searching for within these different categories. And under biomarkers of aging, in the middle, you see the ones that I got 0 hits for. There's still no papers on HO, CO, for instance, and all-cause mortality or telomeres, while there are hundreds on some of the other markers. For human growth, the asterisk means that was a wild card, and see, I've highlighted in bold what the top 5 are. For the disorders of human aging, those are all leading causes of death there, except for the sepsis. And here are the other groups I searched for. The bottom line here is that there's no shortage of research documenting that CO is playing some role in all these aspects, both senescence and death, and at the other end, the growth of cells and tissues. For all that, I'm sure there's a few people on the call who'd like to know what they would recommend they read. And the paper on the left is super important. It's from the guy who came up with the concept of hormesis decades ago, Vincent Calabrese, and he's seeing a connection between carbon monoxide, nitric oxide, and not just brain aging and neurodegenerative disorders, but longevity writ large. At the top right, there's a paper in Japanese, if anybody can help me read it better than Google did, on linking carbon monoxide poisoning effects with aging phenomena in survivors. Finally, and I'll conclude with the implications of this theory for the community and how I think we can move forward with alternative treatments for aging. Number one, I think whether you're a researcher, a product developer, clinician, biotracker, or biohacker, everybody can improve the effectiveness of their methods and reduce their risks by knowing which of their methods are boosting HO1, and which are inhibiting it. If only to take these inducers, inhibitors separately and over 6 hours apart, that'll help you minimize the potential interference and maximize their effectiveness. To give one very common example, zinc, a potent inhibitor, is commonly packaged with vitamin C in supplements, and that's a very potent inducer. Not always, but in this case, and the vitamin C has almost none of the beneficial effects because zinc blocks the heme oxidase pathway through which it obtains those effects. So you can look these up on PubMed, you can ask an expert, but the best would be if you could measure it yourself. Then you can use any portable CO detector that displays from 1 ppm. I wear this little one on my wrist because it's convenient. And you can get little beeper-sized ones as well. The important thing, if you have it, is to leave it on all the time so it can protect you as well from inhaled exogenous CO exposures. For everybody else, I think you also can benefit by knowing your CO level and measuring that on waking. It's an early sign of illness if you're sick. And if you know your hemoglobin, you can also measure your red blood cell lifespan. Measuring your breath CO is as simple as blowing on the detector like this and getting a reading. Unfortunately, mine is only 4 ppm today. Your red blood cell turnover can be slowed. Your red blood cell lifespan can be increased by either boosting your hemoglobin level or lowering your exhaled CO level. Your endogenous production can be slowed by minimizing exposure to HO1 boosters, especially heat and sunlight, right? Stay out of the sun, and minimizing exposure to the inhibitors. And your excretion of the CO you've accumulated from all these sources can be accelerated by many methods. So that's the good news. If you have a normal daily cycle, it should look like that blue line. Bouncing up and down is unhealthy. Sharply rising or falling for days is not unhealthy. If you're pregnant or premenstrual, it's normal, but it doesn't feel so great. We're used to having a normal daily cycle where we return each morning to the level we were at before. And both our temperature and CO levels, which go up and down together when you're healthy, should be lowest in the morning and highest later in the afternoon. If you want to get into modulating your CO, I have a database with hundreds of entries now for not just drugs and supplements, but food, drinks, vitamins, minerals, consumer devices, lifestyle products, medical procedures. And down there at the bottom, just to highlight some interesting contrasts, salt will induce it, sugar will inhibit it. Sunlight induces it, as I mentioned, so cool darkness will inhibit it. Blood transfusions will boost it if you get one, but giving a blood donation will lower it. Here's a project I'm working on with Brent, trying to see how the elements affect HO1. And this is as far as we've gotten with the ones studied so far. As you can see, they're mostly inhibitors, inducers in red. And there's only one pure inhibitor. It's probably, I think, going to end up being discovered to be, like all the others, though, one that can go either way. These transition metals, as they're called, can take many forms. And if they are, you may have to plug in my computer, it's plugged in. If they are also not just depending on their form, I should add, depending on their location in the body, they can either inhibit or induce the pathway. I'm most surprised to see there's only one element on here that's reported to have no effect at all, and that's carbon black, which humans evolved with, of course, from exposure to fires and smoke. And it's interesting that that's the one element that doesn't cause any perturbation of this critical pathway. So lastly, to close, here's my free, safe, and legal methods that you can use to reduce your load without drugs, medications, supplements, diets, or exercise. The first method is just to boost how much CO you're exhaling. It's a rebreather method. I can show you if you just cup your hands and put them together and make a little cup. You can then put your nose in there and rebreathe through your nose and mouth as long as tolerated, like this. That small amount of carbon dioxide you exhale is very high, potent in boosting your breathing. Your body wants to get rid of it. So if you can do that for 10, 20 minutes a day, you'll be exhaling more carbon monoxide and inhaling more oxygen the whole time you do it. If you follow that link, you can get to a YouTube video my wife and I made back in the pandemic that shows you a whole bunch of other types of rebreathers you can make and use. You could pull a t-shirt collar up over your nose, for example, lots of other do-it-yourself options. You can also sunbathe for up to an hour, but as I mentioned about staying out of the sun, that's because of the heat you want to avoid, not the light. If you can sunbathe before you sweat, you'll get the benefits of the light that release CO from your heme proteins in your skin so that you can greatly lower your CO level just by sunbathing. But not again if you go so far as to start sweating, because then you will have started making more CO instead of just releasing the CO you already had. You can, if you can tolerate it, sleep in long sleeve clothing to induce overheating and night sweats. That night sweat is high in CO, as women who've gone through menopause know. And it's not pleasant to get rid of it, but it's a very effective way to get rid of it if you have too much. You can sleep in a dark, cold room with one or more windows open and close the door to the house to keep the house warm. I've got to thank Vince for that. And just think of yourselves as trying to live there like a naked mole rat would in the dark and the cold. And every 60 days or as often as allowed, I recommend people give blood to the Red Cross or get a phlebotomy or get wet cupping done on their back where that's legal, which isn't legal in California and some other states. But all of these methods will drain blood that is contaminated with both bound carbon monoxide to hemoglobin and free carbon monoxide. And your body will replace that over the next week to 10 days. But when you get rid of that, that's blood that you'll never break down internally and that will never produce carbon monoxide in your body. And you can get rid of approximately 10% of your total blood with each donation, or 20% in a 3 months or 4 month cycle. And that is, as far as I can see, the most effective way to reduce how much carbon monoxide you would otherwise make. Your body will make new red blood cells, but they won't turn over for another longer generation. And your body was scheduled to make them anyway, so I don't think this will seriously deplete your erythropoietic stem cells that make new red blood cells. Anyway, that's the theory. And I will stop here showing you someone who just was on Facebook for her 100th blood donation. She gave about twice a year for 50 years, which I think is very impressive, but she could have been giving 6 times a year. And if so, she'd have an even lower CO level now. I think she looks pretty good for 70 something. And I leave you with this haiku. CO is hormetic, deadly if too high or low, vital in between. Thank you so much. I look forward to your questions and comments.
Fantastic. Thank you.
Sorry,
You have an amazing
long,
scope of knowledge. I'm going to ask the first question, please, because I think it's the most critical question. And you did touch on a lot of things, but if you would please take us back to some slides quickly and also send a message to all of GRG highlighting the top practical methods to both reduce CO exposure as well as excrete it. And if you'd send that one slide, that would be really great. Is that something you'd be willing to do now?
Sure. I think you mean this slide with the 5 things they can do?
Yeah.
Great.
But other things,
Sure,
I
we have
mean, okay, don't live in cities. Don't run the car in the garage with the door closed. You know, things like that. What are some other practical common sense things we can do just to avoid exposure?
Also, it seems like 3 and 4 are in conflict.
Yes, they are. You can't do both of those. I appreciate the pointing that out. I had not realized that. I had an alternate fifth I was going to put in there, but then I wanted to honor Vince and acknowledge how important the sleeping in the cold room is. The alternate fifth is what you can do with red light therapy. If you don't want to do sunbathing or you can't do it where you live, you can get red light panels, as Walt has, and many others, and use the red light appropriately to accelerate the excretion of CO from your tissues. It'll come out through your skin if you do it right.
Great, thanks. So now about my question about other practical things we can do, which I'm sure you covered a lot of it at different places in the presentation. That's a lot of stuff though, but if you just tell us or take us back to the slide, practical things to avoid.
Yeah, I'll show you I wish there was a way to get back home. I don't want to just, oh, there we go. At the front here, I had the slide with the pictures of the substances. And what's most important, I think, to remember on these is often you're exposed at somebody else's discretion when you're flying on an airplane, right? Or you're driving in traffic, or your neighbors mowing their lawn and running other gas appliances, maybe their gas grill near you. You may not be able to get away or have any control. And so if you have a personal portable CO detector with you, you can know what's happening, document what's happening, and do something about what's happening. Like you might have to move away, but you might go over to your neighbor and say, hey, did you realize this is really high CO coming out of here and you might be at risk? It's really high even in my yard over here.
Yeah.
But in airplanes, there's often an exposure risk at takeoff and landing from the generator in the tail of the plane. And in heavy traffic, even driving an electric car, you're just as at risk as anybody else if you use the recirculate mode, which captures the exhaust of the car in front of you through leaks in the system and then circulates it, keeps it in the car. Even if you drive through clean air, you can drive around with a cloud of CO in your car. If you leave your air vents on the recirculate mode, I recommend people, if they like that, every now and then do a fresh air flush or just leave it on fresh air because that prevents CO from building up in the car.
Excellent. And what are the brands and models of some of the wrist CO markers and breath analyzers, and where do we get them?
It's on the market. It's by a company called RKI. I have no financial affiliation. RKI makes the Gas Watch Model 3. Unfortunately, the regular CO one is not compensated as it needs to be for hydrogen in your breath, which people with bowel diseases have high hydrogen and it reads like CO and messes everything up. They offer a hydrogen corrected model that's twice as expensive. So if you want to do it right and monitor your hydrogen, and correct for your hydrogen, it doesn't show you the hydrogen, unfortunately, it just corrects for it. You have to spend $500 instead of $250. You may find some other companies now that have a low-level monitor. I'm going to mention one. I haven't tried it yet, but they claim it is hydrogen compensated and it's only $100. And that's from Crowcon, CROWCON. And they have a CO, I think it's called a gas badge. And these,
well, to give a contrary opinion, I think those RKI are junk. They, the range is it only gives one significant digit of accuracy, and I just don't think they're very unfriendly to use.
Thank you, Walt. The one Walt's going to like, he hasn't ordered it yet, is called the Sparrow. The carbon monoxide Sparrow, like the Bird. That doesn't have a display on board, but it's small enough to go on your keychain, carry it anywhere, blow on it when you need to, and read all the results that are recorded and nicely graphed in your smartphone app. It also has 1/10 of a ppm resolution, which the other ones don't have. So that's better as well.
And it cost $189, just for your
It's
information.
about 250 for that one.
Yeah, $189. I have the website.
Oh, 199. Great. Glad to hear it.
Yeah. Well, hey, Albert, you mentioned blood donations. What about both plasma donations and removing old plasma and having it replaced with that from young donors?
Well, this is one of the things I've commented a lot about and actually gave a short presentation about on one of Walt's calls. I could send that presentation around. The bottom line is that it's fine to get rid of blood products. It's really dangerous to get any of them back, especially your own, because they're so badly damaged by going through tubing. So you don't want to ever do the double red plasma donation where they give you your packed red blood cells back. You'd much rather say, thanks, but no thanks, just throw them away. I'll make new ones. Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Your body will
Well,
make new ones, but they won't let you. They want you to take them back. And because they've been damaged, they're now going to break down faster. They're going to lower your red blood cell average lifespan, and they're going to break down and release CO faster than they would have, which shortens your life.
Okay. Is that the case for plasmapheresis, old plasma out, and either replace with saline and albumin or replace with carefully screened plasma from young people in their early 20s?
Right, and I've chided the people on the list who do this for a professional living who haven't measured it yet. But we heard a presentation from one recently who clearly showed and acknowledged some evidence of a HOCO reaction every single time anybody does the plasma transfer exchange. They need to take an antihistamine to ward off a bright red rash reaction that is predicted when your skin gets hot, red, and wet. Remember, that's the hallmark of this HOCO pathway. You'll often read it described as anti-inflammatory, but none of those people have been able to tell me which part of hot, wet, and red is anti-inflammatory, right? That's the mark of inflammation. And what we're trying to avoid, I think, is over-inflaming people. So the literature says if you give somebody albumin, or if you give them somebody else's plasma, I don't know about saline alone, that it will boost the pathway. It will cause them to make more HOCO. And while that looks good in the short term, it's a growth factor. It always looks good in the short term. The problem I keep warning my colleagues about, what's that long-term accumulation? If we could take HO inducers for their benefits and then immediately or shortly thereafter remove the extra CO that left us with, we might be able to get the benefit of the HO induction pathway without paying this price of that CO you produced is not all going to be exhaled. I didn't have time to present it today, but there's a whole mathematical wing of this theory that looks at how the CO is produced at a variant of the Fibonacci rate and how you can modulate that a little bit, but not much. And this determines over your lifetime how quickly the CO will accumulate. Because remember, unlike the iron, where you're just recycling it, with the CO, you make another generation every time you turn it over. So the problem, I think, is these other methods, they boost the pathway in ways that are not being studied by the people who are doing them. All they have to do is take their temperature or their breath CO before and after, and they'll know the first time they do it. And it will probably vary somewhat among men and women, as we've discussed. It'll vary with age, but the trend should usually be the same. It's unusual to find an HO inhibitor that would, say, be an inducer in somebody else. That's not likely, but it could very well be a order of magnitude difference in how much induction you get based on how habituated they are. Just think about what happens when a bunch of people go to a party and the non-smoker tries to smoke something, right? They usually take less than everybody else and they get really sick because they're not habituated.
Well, I really appreciate that perspective. As many of you know, I'm investigating and pursuing therapeutic plasma replacement, old plasma out, young plasma in, and a couple of variations of that. So good to know. And now I think I have a way to test for it. Just you made it, you seem to make it simple. Test before and after. And everything is a risk, I think. We take just about any treatment, just about anything we do has potential negatives. So we have to weigh our risks and measure them very carefully and make intelligent decisions. So thank you.
Well, thank you. Can we go to the chat now? Can you either call on people or give me some questions from the chat? I think I answered my friend Mark questions about the CO detector. In terms of a thermometer, if people buy that, let me mention that please spend the extra $5 and get what's called a basal or pregnancy thermometer that has an extra digit. So you can resolve 99.65 and that way see more sensitive early changes in your temperature when you try any treatment. I see a question here from Chris. Do you have a curve showing average endogenous CO versus age in ppm? No, I'm trying to build it. It seems to vary so much by decade of life. I'm trying to make a map of both what happens to the CO production capacity, the heme oxygenase responsiveness changes over the lifespan. I mentioned it degrades in men, but not women, versus the total accumulation. Women seem to have a higher responsiveness through to death, but they have a lower accumulation. And that's because they spent 1/4 of 30 or 40 years having a period that was lowering their CO level, whereas men spent the same 30 or 40 years without any week off, right? We made extra CO iron every day of the year, while women spent 1/4 of every year not doing that to the same degree. And I believe that's why they live longer in the end. I didn't circle back to those questions I asked, but I think all of the longer lived animals are longer lived because they've managed to figure out ways to avoid jacking up this pathway. And if they do jack it up, they make sure they ventilate it really quickly.
So Albert, just to follow up, you would expect that at the same age, the average endogenous CO levels in women would be less than that for men at the same age?
Yes, and because the men start so much higher through puberty and beyond, and their bodies get bigger and there's more blood volume to turn over and so on, even though men's breath levels start falling in their 40s, they don't actually fall to the level of women usually till they get to their 70s or 80s, because women just never get that high. They've got a smaller body, they never accumulated as much, and so they can pass from their menstrual years into their menopause years with a relatively steady breath CO level that is not seriously changing. And I believe that's giving them some longevity that men are obviously missing out on whatever the benefit is here. But it's not just having more CO because they already have more CO. It's having a more responsive heme oxygenase stress response. And that's why Vince is sleeping in the cold or taking cold showers or doing other relatively harmless HO shock therapy is a good idea. I think Wim Hof goes a little too far. And we don't need to take chemicals to jack this pathway. We can just do it with lifestyle. Does anybody here on the call have any other ideas about how they regularly stress their heme oxygenase or stress pathway? And if they see that as a benefit, like, I don't know, running or if you do any type of exercise, I had a slide at the end that showed a study of joggers in Denver in the 70s when air quality was bad, and they wanted to see if people were jogging in air pollution, would their CO level go up or down? And they found that up to about 7 parts per million in air, they could jog hard enough and breathe enough that it was lowering their CO level after a 40-minute run. But if it was over 7 ppm in air, they couldn't keep up with it. They lowered it a little bit, but they ended up with more than they started with. So a lot depends on our own physiology and how much we can do in response. The reason I like the cupped hands and other methods like the t-shirt is you don't have to do any exercise. The exercise actually makes your CO go up because of the stress of exercise. So your final CO score after an exercise session depends a lot on what exercise you did. And I think that's why the discus and the 100-meter runners didn't do as well as those who were more seriously ventilating in their exercise training. But we can change how much we breathe, right? Just do breathing exercises. The nice thing about the t-shirt and the cup and the cupped hands, it's a reflex. You really don't have to do any effort. Some people have suggested doing this overnight by one method or another. Walt has a method of laying a cloth over your face that also works, but I urge you not to try this at night, sleeping, and only do it when you can be in control of it, because you need to know when you stop doing it. Some people have a panic reaction and they can't put their hands over their face. So obviously, if you have that, don't do this.
And Albert, if you're in a room exhaling your CO2 from 400 ppm outside, goes up to 800 commonly, which is maybe okay. But if you close the door and have no HVAC on, it can go to 2000 fairly quickly in a couple hours. As the CO2 goes up in the room, your exhaled breath also has some carbon monoxide. To what degree does the CO go up in the room versus CO2? So if the room from you or other people breathing, and I know it depends on the people and circumstances,
Yeah.
but roughly if you have 2000 ppm of CO2 in the room, which is not great, how much will your CO2 in your blood go up? 1%? Do you have any data on that?
So let me see if my friend Renee's on the line from the Netherlands. Renee flies around the world a lot with CO detectors and tells a story about when he flies to Asia in a plane full of European non-smokers. There's no CO reading in the plane. When he comes home in a plane full of Asian smokers coming to visit people in Europe, there's 3, 4, 5 ppm the whole time, even though the plane's turning over air really quickly from the bleed air in the engines. That's how they give you air inside an airplane. Because the source, all the people sitting in all the seats, is constant and not being controlled or turned off. There's this steady leak of CO from all the smokers into the room, into the airplane, causing that to happen. That can happen in an automobile. It can happen in a bus or a train. Any microenvironment is more likely than in a big building, of course, because there's less air to contaminate, and it
And
contaminates.
if you exclude smokers, what's the typical correlation of the amount of CO2
There wouldn't
versus
be any.
an exhaled breath?
Well, carbon dioxide in our exhaled breath is 4 to 5%, right? 40 to 50,000 ppm is what we're exhaling, whereas carbon monoxide is normally 1, 2, 3 ppm, very low. So the carbon dioxide, if you're in a room or breathing under a mask and rebreathing carbon dioxide, that's actually a treatment for CO poisoning. It's been a treatment for CO poisoning since the Roman era. Romans used to dig a hole in the ground when troops had CO poisoning and lay them face down in their helmet. They dig a hole for the helmet, put the helmet in the ground, and then put their head in the helmet. And that was like rebreathing in a paper bag. So there is a problem with CO causing impaired breathing. People become very weak breathers and they're going to die of respiratory failure if you don't save them somehow. And by giving them CO2 to rebreathe, whether it's a mask or a helmet or hands or anything, or just a lot of people in the room, any extra CO2 causes us to breathe more, right? Okay. It's not healthy if we do it 8 hours a day, but if we're just doing it briefly to get rid of something that's toxic, it's a great blessing that we can do it.
Okay, so basically, if you have 40 to 50,000 CO2 in exhaled breath, and 1 to 3 ppm of CO, the amount of accumulated CO in the room is not going to be significant at all until it would be absurdly dangerous, like over 5,000 ppms or something. So
nobody
don't
would
worry
be
about
exhaling that, right? Well, the only bad side about a big CO2 exposure is if you're walking into a CO exposure. if you've left one and now you're in clean air with that carbon dioxide, it'll help you breathe faster, just like cranking up the bellows in your fireplace faster. But suppose the CO is in the room with the CO2, and that's called a car. Cars emit a lot of CO2, right? And a lot of CO both. And they often have a leak in the back. And when they have a leak, all the gases come in, not just one or the other. And we end up with a situation where the people in the car are hyperventilating because of the CO2 and more deeply inhaling and absorbing the carbon monoxide and all the other air pollution as a result. Right? It can cause you to more quickly get poisoned and sick. And that's why in the old days, OSHA days, back in the days when OSHA did something, they were very careful about wanting to make sure that people were not overstressed in CO environments where they would start hyperventilating. So heat stress is a big problem around CO exposure sources like a steel mill. And if you're a lot of other reasons to be worried now we know about heat, because if you have a heat stress reaction, you're having a CO reaction. There's no body temperature increase without a CO increase to go with it. And we just didn't know that back then. But now that we do, I'm hoping that makes this more relatable to people. They're familiar with a thermometer and what the numbers mean, right? Even if they're not familiar with a CO detector and what the numbers mean. If we could teach people that when you have a fever, you have CO poisoning, then the symptoms would make sense as well. Oh, that's why I got a headache and brain fog and whatever else. So let me see if there's any other questions I'm missing. Somebody's been telling people about my birthday. Thank you.
Johnny, could you please define the protocol for asking questions? I don't know if I should be raising my hand or typing into the chat or what.
Well, we try to take it in the order that they're asked, but yeah, we have two competing ways of asking questions. So sounds like you have a question, so you go.
Well, okay. Two things. One, why would you make a blanket? Just let me say them both and then I'll shut up. Why would you make a blanket policy of taking no supplements when we know perfectly well that nature never delivers perfection? And indeed, our food is often deficient compared to ancient food. And secondly, it seems like it's a one-way street. We're all accumulating carbon monoxide in our tissue, and it's just steadily growing. I mean, with some variation, but it's steadily growing as we age. So basically, we are all in a condition where we would benefit from reducing the carbon monoxide in our tissue. That's all.
Absolutely agree with you on the second one. And on the first point, here I am. I got my physical last year at 65. There wasn't a single biomarker in the red zone or even the yellow zone. So, apparently paying no attention to diet, exercise, or any healthful habits is just fine with me. And I look back and say, what really saved my ass for the last 60 years was not buying and using consumer personal care products the way other people use them, right? I didn't, like women do, shave my armpits and put chemicals in my lymph nodes. I didn't shave my face and put chemicals in my face. And I don't want to take supplements until I know what's in the pill. And I haven't found a company that convinced me that they're telling me the truth about what's in that pill. Whereas when I go buy meat or fish or fowl or vegetables, I'm pretty sure I'm getting what I'm paying for. So, plus my wife's a nutrition professor, and she would really have a problem with us spending any amount of money on nutrition in a bottle and a pill, because she taught her whole career that nutrition comes from food, and if your grandparents didn't eat it, we have that, try to live that rule, then don't buy it. If your grandparents couldn't have found it and wouldn't have known what to do with it. But I'm not in the best health. I got to admit, I have a right bundle branch blockage from a Lyme infection years ago that has pretty much taken a chunk of my heart out. And I can't overexercise because my heart's too big and I'll blow up.
But it's correct to say that older people actually have accumulated CO2 to a level that's not healthy in their tissue. Is that right?
Yeah, and the scary part is, we can't see it. We can't measure it because it's deeper in tissue. Chris and I were talking about how well my breath holding method can see the level in tissues, but it only sees an average level of all tissues and organs. And we don't know which organ might be failing ahead of another. But we do know that one of the ways organs fails is they just lose their capacity to do oxidative work. And it was only yesterday that I realized these other senescent cells, beyond red blood cells, might be senescent because they have CO in them that's basically causing them to go into suspended animation. And so my new challenge is trying to learn more about how we might get the CO out of those cells because they're not accessible like red blood cells are. I don't think we'll have a long-term problem with CO accumulation if we teach people how to get rid of it. Why would anybody allow it to build up?
Well, do you want it to build up a little because you say if it's too low, it's bad?
Glad you noticed that. Yes, I want some. I want to be able to make some when I need it in response to any stressor, infection, break my bones, get in a car wreck, right? All of those types of emergencies and psychological ones, like losing my son. I needed stress support, and I'm glad I was able to bring it into gear. A part of what a stress reaction does is puts you into shock. So much CO, it makes you forget everything that just happened to you, which psychiatrists think is part of being able to survive those horrible events, right? But that comes from a stress reaction that's so high, the CO gives you a complete memory loss of what happened. So I don't want to go that high. I'd like to keep it under control. And I'm looking into, although I said I was giving away the free stuff today, I'm hoping I'll be able to work with companies who want to develop more aggressive tools to use in clinical settings where we could lower people's CO levels much faster with more aggressive methods, but still non-invasive, just suck it out of them.
What about Steve Beckbus's questions about hyperbaric oxygen and what's the other thing here? Shock proteins, heat shock proteins.
Well,
Hyperbaric
I think
oxygen.
we should go back to the cue that was in, well, whatever Albert wants to answer, it's his show, but
Mike
I
Jacobs had
suggest
his
we
hand
go
up. Can
back
we
to
take-
the cue that's in the chat. Are there still some questions there?
I'm happy to go back to the Q in the chat, but I saw Mike's hand up and I wonder if we could take his call.
Well, Chris has
No.
has his hand up too. So you answer what you want to answer.
Okay, Chris, you got one. I'll circle back. But go ahead, Miles.
No. Thanks, Albert. No, I had the same question as Walter, because hyperbaric oxygen, and I think Steve is the expert here. Maybe Steve can also comment on this. Steve Buss.
What's the question?
I posted a study link, not a study link, a picture of a study abstract that says that it's heat shock protein 70 that is the, or probably one of the key mediators of the positive effects of CO. And there is the infamous, now famous, 2015 Finnish sauna study done on only men over 25 years, published 2015. And what it demonstrated is that increasing time in the sauna and frequency of what they call sauna bathing profoundly increases survival probability. And sauna, each HSP70 does increase HO1.
Let me address that, Steve. It's a pretty easy answer. It all has to do with the net impact of your activity. So if you go into a sauna and you're exposed to heat, you're obviously going to induce not just HSP 70, HSP 32, 36, and every other one with a number because they're all heat shock proteins, right? They all react to heat. So they'll all go up. And that will cause your carbon monoxide level to go up. I'm not aware of an interaction between CO affecting the activity of HSP70, but I'll definitely look at that. It's the other two HSPs that are making the CO, though, in response to heat. The question was, why would sauna look beneficial? And I'm trying to answer it. The reason is the net. While heat makes CO go up, sweating lowers CO because sweat can be very high in CO. So the net effect of going into a therapy that involves a lot of sweating, a native sweat lodge is something I also have experience with and have measured CO before and after in, or a regular sauna, you can both raise the CO to some degree from the heat and then lower it to a greater degree with the sweating. Just as exercising people can raise CO from exercise and then lower it by the type of ventilation they're doing while they exercise. So I'm not saying it's incompatible. It could well be the case that this is why saunas look so much better than not doing.
You said avoid heat and avoid increases in HO1. But what we know from multiple published studies is that sauna bathing, which increases heat, increases survival probability. We also know that hyperbaric oxygen therapy increases HO1 and has profound health benefits, also increasing survival probability and other benefits. My objection isn't to detailed explanations. My objection is to very short statements prescribing action by people listening to the presentation, and those prescriptions run against what studies show is useful for increasing survival probability. That's my objection.
Okay, first I'm going to answer your question by asking Albert, had you completed your answer?
Well, there's another point I need to raise about the hyperbaric oxygen's effects. I've studied, I'm trying to show you, and I can give you guys the link. It's this tiny poster, tinyurl.com CO poster, like the other ones. I believe the year is 2018. And that poster shows an assessment of carbon monoxide treatments that have been published since the 1800s, including a detailed analysis of the effects of both hyperbaric and high flow oxygen, a literature review with a scatter plot showing the results. And the results are not good from the perspective of CO poisoning. It's now widely recognized that too much oxygen is causing the rate of delayed neurological sequelae to go up instead of down. And that's because CO is pushed by oxygen from the blood into tissues where it's more harmful. This is all very well documented in decades of research. And I'm sorry if you haven't read it, but it's quite convinced me and most other people who study CO that CO is much more harmful in tissues than in blood. And if you give somebody hyperbaric oxygen, you're going to push that, push the CO off of the hemoglobin and on into tissues. The mistake had been for years we thought that it was all exhaled, but as I explained before, you can never get rid of all your CO and you absorb some of it. And the oxygen therapy makes how much you absorb go up instead of down. And it feels great when you get it, but it increases the risk of delayed neurological sequelae that occur in weeks to months afterwards. And that's just the fact. It makes them go up. It's a trade-off. You feel great in the short term with almost all types of oxygen therapy, but you pay a price later. And you can measure it if you want to see it. But if oxygen is well known to make CO go up, and that's not the goal here. We're trying to make it go down. The takeaway from my presentation is that CO is not a problem and going up is not a problem. Keep doing what you're doing because it's going to make it go up. And you can see it when you're done the oxygen therapy. So,
Steve, does that answer your question?
I was just pointing out what the sauna study showed over 25 years in a statistically significant number of men only. it was over 2,000, that it profoundly increased survival probability. I don't understand all of what Albert said, but the study results are clear, and those same study results have been repeated numerous times. So his explanation is kind of irrelevant. I mean, unless he's going to dispute the study.
Well, sweating is not irrelevant. Sweating is an extremely important measure by which people naturally get rid of too much CO. Ask a woman in menopause. She can have night sweats rather, for a decade, getting rid of CO that has accumulated in their tissues. So I don't want to dismiss sweating as an extremely important way to get rid of CO. Typically, CO survivors in the first couple of weeks after they survive have the greatest episodes of night sweats, and then it tapers off. So I do think in a sauna setting, if the study didn't look at this, a future study could, and perhaps see that although there's an increase in CO from heat, there may be a greater decrease in CO from the sweating.
So Albert, are you in support of sauna or against it or neutral?
I guess my philosophy for all of these things is measure it. If you know what you're trying to accomplish, then all you have to do is measure it and you'll see if you've accomplished it or not. If you don't know what you're trying to do, it doesn't really matter either. But if you have a concept of, I think my CO should go up or I think my CO should go down, well, then you just measure it. As I said, it can have a very different effect on people depending on their habituation. If you've ever been in a native sweat with anybody who knows what they're doing and you didn't, you know they can tolerate it a lot better than you can. Right? So you're going to have to get out of there before them. Your effects will be different.
So can I conclude from that? You would say sauna is okay as long as you know your CO level is not already excessive going in and you don't want to raise it further?
Well, you're going to raise it, but you might be able, by the sweating and other activities you may do in conjunction with the sauna experience, to make it nevertheless go down. Right? That's the difference between the discus athlete who's not running a great distance, right? No distance at all, and a marathon runner who gets more aerobic exercise out of it. The one side is how much you make, but the other half of the equation is how are you getting rid of it? Are you actually doing an aerobic activity, or are you doing a non-aerobic athletic activity like weightlifting? Right? We wouldn't expect weightlifting to have the same aerobic benefits as running marathons. And why are marathon runners skinny and weightlifters heavy? Who's got more CO in their body? Who's growing more tissue? Who's turning over more red blood cells every week, every day, every hour? The bigger person has to turn over more blood because they have more blood. So they have a higher CO level. And guess what? Big people don't live long. Right? All centenarians are skinny. So I think a big problem that men have that we can hardly avoid is our bodies get really big. And then we have to deal with that accumulated garbage that Aubrey so I think insightfully identified. Not just that we have some aging clock, it's accumulating some garbage. And what is that garbage? I don't think we could say it's the iron because the iron volume doesn't change. It just keeps turning over.
So you mentioned CO habituation, and evidently people who are CO habituated can tolerate a higher level of CO. Is there a way for people who are not CO habituated to stimulate that same, I guess, expulsion of CO?
What do you mean by expulsion? If you're not habituated, and it's not so much that, well, it's a physics question, maybe, or a chemist, I think it's a physics question. If you put a smoker and a non-smoker in a room, the smoker is exhaling, say, 10 parts per million, and the non-smoker is exhaling 1 part per million. And now you bring in a CO source, maybe they're cooking dinner on a grill. As soon as the CO goes above 1 in the room, the non-smoker starts absorbing it. But the smoker won't absorb any until it's over 10, because it's a gas, it runs downhill like water. So when 5, 6, or 7 goes in their lungs, it can't get past the 10 that's already coming out the other way. And only when it gets higher will it start to have an effect on them. So they actually have a lower, shorter exposure period, right? Because they're not absorbing any in the beginning. And then when it does start to be absorbed, they have a higher level naturally, that because of the shape of the binding curve means they're going to much more quickly and effectively bind up the CO they're breathing onto their blood, so less of it goes in their body, into their tissues. When non-smokers breathe CO, it takes them a while to build up to that steeper part of the curve where this binding is effective. And at the low end, they can breathe CO without binding it for days, and it just goes right through into their body. And that wouldn't happen to a smoker. So the smoker is protected by their habituation. That's a hard concept, because it's not quite the same as how alcoholics are protected by their habituation, but sort of the same. Alcoholics start drinking, they're obviously ingesting the alcohol, but it clearly doesn't have any major effect on them until they get past their tolerance point, right?
As far as the order of questions, rather than having the two competing systems, please type them in the chat. But if for some reason, it's such tiny print or you just can't type, then raise your hand. Okay? Thanks.
I see a question about saunas and hot showers and so on. I do think the first step for people who are trying to modulate this is to just measure it. See if you have a normal daily cycle. Do you look like a nice sine wave that's low in the morning and high in the afternoon? Or do you look like a crazy sawtooth pattern? Or are you flatlining? Or are you going up for 3 days in a row? And then decide, oh, I'm okay, or I have to do something. I'm thinking many people are hopefully okay and they don't have to do anything except monitor it. People who monitor it, Chris told us once he was able to detect a flu for 3 days before he noticed the symptoms because his CO had started to go up already. So same with cancers and other worse outcomes. The literature shows if you get one of these chronic diseases, fill in the blank, you're going to end up with a chronically higher CO level. And then it's up to somebody to figure out, why is it higher? It obviously isn't a very specific marker if it can be elevated in 200 diseases. And that's why you sometimes need to get a whole lot more of those tests done to figure out, do I really have this? Well, let me look for another question. I don't keep going on about that. Is there an effect of CO poisoning on graying of the hair? Yes, and also on falling out of the hair. High stress makes hair fall out and CO makes it grow back, and that's why FDA has approved red light therapy for hair growth, because the red light therapy in the hair helmets actually causes CO to move around in your scalp underneath that, and that helps hair grow. So there are lots of benefits for brief, targeted use of CO to do things. For instance, to treat and heal wounds, your body is using CO every time you have a wound to close it and heal it and grow new skin over it and so on. And you could enhance that by delivering CO just there if you wanted to, but I wouldn't recommend taking a systemic HO inducer if you want to treat, a cut on your finger. Let's see, do some people have better CO excretion systems? Young people have better excretion systems than older people. Yes, and they also have less CO in their body to begin with. So as a percentage of their total, they're not yet cutting into their functional capacity. That's a big problem as we get older and our tissues fill up with CO, they have less and less room left for oxygen. And we can measure this effect with our body temperature because the basal rate of HO2, the constitutive one, is giving us our basic body temperature, and HO1 gives us the elevation on top of it. So if your basal body temperature is only 96 or 95 Fahrenheit, that's an HO2 problem, is running low. Your HO1 doesn't actually even be detectable most of the time unless you stress it. And although many people, again, think it's beneficial, I am one of them as well, to stress your pathway every now and then to keep it resilient and responsive. We all know it's not good to keep your foot on the stress accelerator all the time, right? Over and over again for 50 years, people teach in every part of medicine, a little bit of stress, okay. chronic stress, bad. And so I fear for the people who take, like my dear friend Chris, a lot of supplements every day. He's stepping on that gas pedal every day, all day long, and never giving his body a rest from whatever level of HO induction he's giving it. Or, depending what he's taking, he may be inhibiting some of that, right? He may be taking zinc with vitamin C and other things, and then a lot of it isn't even working.
So a little bit of clarification to that, Albert. So since you and I met, I did separate the things into the inducers and inhibitors. So I was increasing my CO in the morning when my body is cold. And this week is one of the weeks when I take a complete break from like 98% of the supplements to give my body a break. I do that occasionally.
Well, be careful when you go back on them. Many of them are likely to feel as if they've become more effective because the brief withdrawal causes you to lose some habituation, and then they are going to provoke a bigger response afterwards. And that's fascinating. Taking a drug holiday like that is often done at the recommendation of doctors for patients whose drugs seem to have stopped working. They just stop it for a week or two and get back on it again. It'll often come back in a bigger way. I'm seeing people ask about CO2 levels up to 5,000 in a hyperbaric chamber. I wouldn't worry about the CO2. I'd worry about the oxygen. I don't know about the Finnish sauna study, as I mentioned, but I will definitely look for the HSP 70 effect. Does frying food raise CO? Yes. And you have to measure it to know. It depends on your burner and your pots and pans, but you can make plenty of CO in a home with electric appliances. I had a client who ran me around in circles for a long time over the phone trying to find out how she had poisoned herself and her family in her all-electric cabin. And it turned out that the food they loved to cook every weekend when they went to the all-electric cabin was blackened catfish. So imagine that's like frying charcoal, right? If you get to blackened catfish. And they were doing that on their electric range thinking it was just fine. So it can be a problem, and you should just obviously ventilate your kitchen as well as you can when you're cooking anything, because baking or browning food makes CO come off of it. You can measure CO coming out of a toaster. Somebody's writing about Sparrow website. Could we boil it down to an actionable thing? The actionable thing is measure your CO every morning when you wake up. Keep it next to your bed, and your CO will go up naturally during the day and then come down again at night, even if you don't do anything stressful, if you don't eat or drink anything. But as you'll discover, many things you do will cause detectable spikes within the next couple hours after, rarely within 5 or 10 minutes, but usually within 2 or 3 hours.
I got a follow up on that. Thanks for the info, Albert. Yeah, I'm just curious. I mean, so you get up in the morning. I'm just thinking through as like if I'm a consumer, I wake up. How do I? So I'm testing my CO levels. Am I blowing into the device through?
Yes.
There. Okay. So I blow into some device. It says, okay, my level is X. Then I go through my day. I do a bunch of things, and suddenly it's much higher. But how do I know if that's, bad or good? I mean, if there's like, are there clinical ranges to say, oh, like you're suddenly out of this range that is good now, whatever I've done?
The range that matters, there's so many, and it's so personal, and it's so gender and age specific. The range that matters is your range. And I encourage people to start measuring these biomarkers when they're healthy. So just as with temperature, if you don't know what your basal is and something comes into town and you get it, you don't know if your normal is 96 or 98. It can make a big difference where you're headed. More often in the morning, what the CO breath test is revealing is, uh-oh, I had a bad night and I'm going to have a bad day. I woke up at 10 or 20. If you wake up at 2 or 3, you could say, oh, I'm going to have a good day today. I can burn up a lot of spoons, if you know that analogy. But if you wake up at 10 or 20, you're going to like pull the covers back over your head and not go too many places, because you realize your capacity is already greatly limited right from the start of the day. Your respiratory capacity would be inhibited at 10 to 20. your thinking capacity might be as well. You might have more brain fog if you're not used to it. So I encourage people to use it like a daily barometer of stress, and then come home and do it again before you go to bed at night and see, okay, I recovered from whatever I went through today, or uh-oh, I'm still high. Hopefully I'll be down there in the morning, because if not, I've just spent one day going from a lower level this morning to a higher level tomorrow morning and absorbed all the difference into my body, or at least for my formula, you've absorbed the Fibonacci rate times a factor, which is how much of that did I actually excrete versus inhale. And I've done some math, and it looks like most people are right around 50%. It's just really hard to get below, or however you look at it, it's really hard to exhale more than half of what you inhaled, or half of what you made. It's like the tortoise and the hare. You can get closer and closer to the end zone, right? But you can never fully empty your lungs or any other part of your body of CO, because behind it, you're making it 24/7. It's like bailing a boat that's leaking. You can't bail it.
That device, I know maybe Walt was kind of just showing one. So I don't know if you have a link to those or whatever, but so like you're mentioning supplements as an example. I mean, if I measure my CO, I blow in it, and then I take, let's just say 50 supplements, then I blow in it again. Are you saying that it probably would like go up or down?
From my experience with my clients, if you take a handful, like many people do in the morning, and go back 3 hours later, you can be kicked up into the 10 to 30 ppm range for a couple hours, and then it'll come down again. Now, maybe the point was, maybe many of these things are effective because, in fact, the person was low. Remember, the thing about a hormetic curve is you don't know where you are on it until you know where you are on it. If you're at the low end, Steve, are you listening? Boosting CO is great. You need to boost it. You're below the sweet spot. You need to get up to the sweet spot. But if you're already in the sweet spot, going above it is taking really big risks, because you keep walking closer and closer to the cliff that says, uh-oh, now we're in the toxicity range, right? You don't want to get to the toxicity range or the other end. I made some slides, Jason. I asked you if I could have your permission to show them, and I didn't get it, so I didn't show them. But what I went through, and I looked at your slides of hormesis.
Yes, yeah, I did respond, by the way.
I missed it. I apologize. I hope you said yes. If so, can I show the slide? Okay, so I'm going to show the slide now. Jason has a great slide about hormesis, and I wanted to point out how the analysis of the slide reveals something very depressing at the end. It reveals that there is a natural limit to aging, and we can't get past it. And it's because of the shape of this curve. Can you guys see this now? Am I sharing my screen?
Yes.
Yes.
Hello?
Yeah.
Okay, so this is Jason's screen. The hormesis curve is an example of one that's cut off the left side. The effector that on the trait, that y-axis, isn't really at x equals 0. I don't think it is, right? There's more dose to the left. But that hormetic zone in the middle at the top, I totally agree. That's in the right place. And the toxicity is over there to the right at the high end. And here we've created a curve that has the positive effect on the top. So now let's add the rest of the curve. So the range of deficiency is when x is less than 1, the x1 I marked on the axis on the left, and the range of toxicity starts at greater than x2. The mark in the middle I'm calling x prime, and y prime, its partner on the y-axis. That is the peak level of improvement, right? The highest level we can get out of this curve of improvement is at a dose that's in between two other doses, x1 and x2, which produce the same effect. Interesting quirk of hormetic curve, right? x1 and x2 are different doses, one higher than the optimum, one lower than the optimum, and they're producing the same effect that is less than optimal. But the problem for longevity people is we can't get past the fact that x prime is in the middle. You can't keep increasing the dose in either end and get a better effect. You have to find x prime, and then y prime is what you get. You can't modify this in a way that would get you past it. So I created the statement for every HO stressor, there's only going to be one dose x prime that yields the maximum effect y prime, obviously for any individual. In contrast, there are infinite pairs of doses X1 and X2 that yield a result Y that's less than optimal, that yields Y prime. So
yeah, this is good. No, thanks, Albert. Yeah, it looks amazing, and I 100% agree. It's like finding that optimal range, that optimal dose, and I guess I kind of see this as like one metric that you may track amongst, a bunch of other things, and I'm wondering like where it kind of goes into the optimization. I mean, if I'm optimizing for, strength, or if I'm optimizing to minimize, other toxins, or other parameters, right, with your day to day. Like, how do you see like this kind of fitting in? Like, if I see suddenly, say I see mine are way too high, like whatever I've been doing, let's just say I went in the sauna for a whole hour, which of course that's a little bit too much, right? You're gonna have some toxicity, or whatever you're doing
maybe
that
not. Right?
is
It
too.
depends how much you sweat. Some people get in the sauna and they sweat buckets. Other people get in the sauna and they don't sweat too much.
Yeah.
But it's
Well,
giving
it could
off
be it could be
more
too much
CO
for
than the
other
other.
reasons, I guess. It could be like too much of a stressor, but for other metrics. So I'm kind of wondering like where do you see this kind of fitting into the optimization? Like you check, and then if you kind of get your baseline, and then if you see it goes out of whack, too high or too low, then I guess you would know whatever you did altered that biomarker. Is that kind of how you think of it, or?
Yes, and I calculated out, and I don't have time or place to present it here, but I calculated out using the Levitt's formula what optimal level of CO in your breath and hemoglobin in your blood, because those are the only two variables in the formula, would give you an optimal red blood cell lifespan. And by optimal, I mean long enough to get you to 100 years old if you go through 3 generations of red blood cells a year. That's an average normal healthy person. Would give you 3 a year for 100 years, would be 300 of them, of these generations. And it turns out that won't get you there. That's not good enough. By that formula, you need to have a lower number of generations per year and a longer lifespan, somewhere around 150 to 180 days, before you can be confident of getting all of those cycles of red blood cell generation. And if you look at it from a perspective of the CO level in your breath, the formula kicks you out if your CO is over 3. So to be optimal, you would have to have CO be 1 or 2. And there's not a lot of room between 1 and 2 and 0, right? It's a really small window for people who've grown up in fresh air and aren't habituated to CO anymore. We don't have a lot of room to work with to find X prime in our own lives, right? And all I'm sure is X prime is nowhere near 5, 10, 15, or 20, which is where it is in people who are really sick and in ICUs and things. So Steve's going to juice it up with these various activities he does. Hopefully he'll stop somewhere short of, say, 10 parts per million, because that's more than 10 times higher than we normally have. And it's going to cause some accumulation that I just can't see how in the long term that's beneficial. Most of the studies of the HO pathway that found benefits, as I mentioned, didn't actually measure, track, trace, or even mention what happened to the carbon monoxide in their experiment. They knew it was created, they just didn't worry about it because they were focused on effects from other parts of the experiment. Gotcha. So that's why it's so important that we do the experiment, you do the experiment, everybody taking anything, do the experiment. And someday our government may require labels on products to say if something makes HO go up or down, so people could rationally plan what they do. But until then, I'm hoping and begging for some supplement company to break the ice. I was hoping Vince would do it, but then he got sick and had to stop work. So I'm not sure he'll ever get back to it. But some companies got to go first and tell people that this is happening, I think, and disclose honestly which way their product makes it go.
Yeah, I mean, I guess the challenging thing, because obviously, yeah, I mean, if I've a affiliate supplement, I mean, I would test that at some point and make that determination. But I guess the tricky part is like, there's two layers. I mean, one, when I blow into the thing, I mean, there's air on that measurement, and that's only based on breath. I mean, I'd have to do blood for more accurate. And of
No,
course,
actually not. Blood's not more accurate.
blood's not more accurate. Well, it'll give you
The
a
methods are much less reliable, less reproducible,
Yeah.
and they're expensive and painful. So there's really no reason to do blood anymore. You can only measure 2 compartments, artery and vein. And with my breath method, you can measure 4. And critically, you see the other 2 compartments where there's more CO. The blood, turns out, is only shuttling CO back and forth between your lungs and all your other tissues and organs. They're where there's a higher reservoir of CO usually than in your blood, unless you have a blood cancer. And hopefully that's
Gunther, Chris, I believe you've been waiting, and Jason, we can circle back to you later.
No worries. Thank you. Appreciate it.
Gunther typed it in the chat.
Yeah, I had a question about the regions, like a natural regions where there's a lot of CO2, like Yellowstone, and if there is if there is a specific variation, like a diversity in a CO versus CO2 seepage from the natural regions.
Are you talking about the geysers and hot springs at Yellowstone that give off gas from the ground?
In addition to the water, there is a lot of CO and CO2, but I don't know what the variation.
And hydrogen sulfide and many other dangerous gases come out of the ground. It's the reason there was an oracle at Delphi for 1,000 years. They would go underground and get poisoned by the gases and claim they could divine the future because it messed up their thinking so much. They experienced hallucinations that regular people who were not in the gas cave did not experience. So I haven't been to Yellowstone since I was a little kid, but I still remember the whopping headaches. So I imagine that's still an issue. And rangers do carry multi-gas analyzers with them. So they're warned if there's a cloud seeping their way, because some of these clouds don't have detectable odor. Hydrogen sulfide in particular has a blind nose band in the middle of detection when you can't smell it, but it's still there. So I do think that's an issue, but outdoors, it turns out even the worst imaginable, we think, CO experience, like being near a forest fire, doesn't create that much ground level CO because it all goes up into the atmosphere with the heat. And there's very little at ground level. I drove through a Western wildfire smoke situation for a week a few years ago near Canada in the US borderland area. We couldn't see 10 feet in front of us, but there was no CO in the air. It was just particulates at that point because the fires were 1,000 miles away. So you should take your CO detector with you. And the most likely place you'll be poisoned in a national park is in the cafeteria. From the kitchen. Like my wife's taking me out to dinner tonight for my birthday. We'll have to do the song and dance about what do we do if we discover there's a CO poisoning problem in the restaurant again. I'd like to make it to a dinner without having that happen. Anybody else have a question? I'm happy to stay on a little longer. Okay.
Well, Chris had one, but first let me jump in. Okay. You know, related, there's a thing called the station wagon effect where if you're in a station wagon, and I had this happen to me, and I'd learned about this in my Coast Guard auxiliary boating skills and seamanship, where like if you're in a station wagon and people are in the back, like in a national park driving around with the top up, you know, it has the thing on the bottom, but still the top up, there's some natural effect where the exhaust is drawn back into the occupancy area. Same thing on a boat. If you have the canvases down on the sides, but the back open, the exhaust will be drawn up into the cabin area. So I just felt compelled to put that in there. So Chris, you have a question?
That's what happens to everybody's car. That was what I was talking about. When you drive down the road, if your car has a seal leak or an unplugged hole in the rear end somewhere, anywhere, your exhaust will come in through that hole and fill the car. That's what happened to the Ford Explorers that had a problem for 10 years before they gave up and built a new model. The CO, once it gets in your car or boat or whatever, driving down the road like that, if you don't know it's there, it's going to stay there unless you do something to get rid of it, like opening all the windows again. So I urge you, if you get a CO detector, don't leave it at home. Carry it with you everywhere, and you'll learn where and how in your life you're exposed, and you can adapt accordingly. Most people are more exposed driving around than they are in their own home, because then they're exposed to other people's cars. And there's a whole lot of Homer Simpsons driving around with black electrical tape over the check engine light. And that's usually the catalytic converter, and who wants to spend $1,000 on that, right?
Yeah. Chris, do you have a question?
He withdrew a question about, is sauna better for men because men sweat more than women, but I don't know why he withdrew it. I don't know who sauna would be better for, Chris, but the question of who sweats more is really interesting. Obviously, in menopause, women can drench the bed every night for a decade. That seems like pretty prodigious sweating to me. I don't know of any men who do that.
David has his hand up.
I guess it's my turn.
Oh,
yeah. This thing. This is actually a combustible gas detector. I got it when I was in a temporarily living in a motorhome just to check for propane gas. I don't know, it's just a kind of a related topic. Do you have any thoughts or comments on all that? And my specific question is, I think this is 30 or 40 bucks on Amazon. It appears to be working. I think I tested it once, but any general comments on the importance of testing for combustible gases? Say, oh yeah, old heating units, like 30, 40-year-old heaters in people's homes have been known to emit CO. So, general question, any comments?
Everyone should have a personal portable CO alarm. The home alarms are utterly worthless. They're worse than worthless. If they have a digital display, they actually are required by the UL standard, which is supported by our Federal Consumer Product Safety Commission. For 40 years now, they've been required to show the number 0 until the level of CO is 30. Can you imagine if automakers had a speedometer that showed 0 until you got to 30 because they didn't want to worry you? Don't you worry your little head. Don't you go calling the fire department or the gas company either, because we don't think it's a problem and we don't want to be bothered. So let's hide that with a 0. You need a personal portable that displays from 1 part per million, like my little gas watch here, so you cannot be fooled. The level at which the environmental epidemiology studies show people, remember, are dying, 1% increase in all-cause mortality from 1 part per million going up, right? You would never see that in a home alarm that says 0 until 30. And this is 1 part per million over background levels that are also about 1 part per million. So the problem is at this low end, even a small chronic level of over 8 to 10 hours is a problem. A brief exposure, no. The epidemiology studies are looking at 8 and 24-hour windows. That's where they're seeing the problem. And sometimes it's a lag of up to 7 days later. So the best advice is just don't get into those situations. And if you know that you do, take some step to make your CO go back down again. Avoid stressors, avoid HO inhibitors, maybe take some avoid the inducers for a while and take some of the inhibitors. Most people take so many things. I say you don't have to start taking anything new. Just do what Chris did and separate the inducers and the inhibitors into 2 groups, and then try taking them separately to see if they're more effective.
Yeah.
You might get more.
So did you say for these devices there's a law that it can't tell you?
Regulation. Yeah.
Oh, okay. So that explains the song and dance I got when I bought a couple of them. I held them up to the propane coming out unlighted, and it did nothing.
This doesn't apply to the propane detector. The propane detectors, I'm not sure how good they are. That's a whole nother area of problem, is that we don't have good natural gas detectors in America. They don't give early warning. They only warn of explosion levels. But there is now in most hardware stores a new brand of home natural gas detector to warn you if you're going to have an explosive leak in your kitchen, for instance. But that can't detect carbon monoxide and vice versa, so you need both if you're worried about it. And again, the CO detector I recommend is not something that goes on your wall. It's something that you carry around personally. So whether you're in the car, the restaurant, or at home, you are protected. And that's, again, in a week, you'll learn where your exposures are because they tend to be recurring, stable exposures around particular environments. Like if you regularly go to a restaurant where there are sloppy cooks in the back and they don't turn the fan on, you'll get that reading out front where the seats are as likely as not. But if you're in a much bigger environment, you're not probably going to pick up these minor problems.
Very
Most people
good.
are not so sensitive anymore. Well, I hope. If we've gotten to this age, we've accumulated enough stress, I love CO, that most of us are a little calmer than our puberty years. But if you think back to puberty, that's the steepest time of CO increase in humans in our lives. And if you think about what CO does to people, I think you could make a case for CO causing a lot of the problems of puberty in teenagers in terms of how it affects their thinking, their regulation of everything that they're involved with, right? Seems chaotic, but to CO survivors, that's kind of like what they live with.
Okay.
Do you have any
Dave?
CO survivors on the call? And I'm curious if anybody could speak up about their experience in being poisoned and recovering.
Well, if my experience with getting it from the boat, I had headaches and felt ill and then felt better. I was okay. So does that count?
Yeah, you were able, probably because you were on a boat out in fresh air, to relatively quickly recover. The real CO victims aren't the ones who've been exposed for an hour or two. They're the ones who've been exposed for a year or 5 years, because nobody ever came and found the problem in their house. And you can imagine how much more you would build up if it's every day. Same with those people in the ICUs, on the ventilators, on the ECMO machines. They're on them a long time. And if the doctors aren't paying attention, the CO builds up just because they're not doing anything to make it go down again. The doctors could, they have lots of tools available, but we learned in COVID they weren't using them. And they were still using those pulse oximeters on people's fingers that can't distinguish oxygen and carbon monoxide. They also have a dark skin tone bias, but not reading carbon monoxide is an even bigger problem because you could have 99% oxygen on your pulse oximeter that was actually 98 oxygen and 1 CO, or it could be 78 oxygen and 21 CO, and it would still read 99.
Really?
And a big problem in COVID that FDA only addressed very late, and they haven't solved it yet, is how can we get manufacturers to make pulse oximeters that don't have this problem? If they could distinguish whether you had dark or light skin, they could adjust the reading for that. But for CO, the existing instrument that measures the difference, it's called a Massimo Red 57. It sells for $5,000. Nobody wants to buy that. But it also measures your hemoglobin non-invasively. So if you do have $5,000 kicking around, you could measure your breath, your CO and your hemoglobin every morning as often as you like with a clip on your finger. And you could then plug that into Levitt's formula and have a day-to-day measure of your red blood cell lifespan that's been validated against gold standard radio-labeled measures in breath. So that could be very cool if somebody had the discipline to do that. I saw one study preparing this talk that I didn't put in of a menstruating woman who hemoglobin and CO were level, measured across a month, and it had huge swings in it, which clearly must have been related to her menstrual cycle. Her normal, remember, is about 120 days. She was swinging from 60 to 190, plus or minus 50% in a month, just by whether or not she was in that premenstrual week when she's breaking down a lot of red blood cells, and the red blood cell lifespan seems very short to the formula because her breath CO was higher, versus the week her period began, her breath CO level comes down very quickly, and now the formula thinks, oh, you have a very long red blood cell lifespan now, just because her CO went from maybe 10 to 2 in a day. And I didn't realize, looking at that graph, how much women's hemoglobin moves as well. Men just don't have that. So our whole experience of aging is that this inexorably accumulates in us unless we do something to get rid of it. And that's why I'm mostly when I recommend people give blood if they can get rid of it. That way, if the Red Cross will take it. I saw a paper where Europe was trying to decide at what age to cut people off giving, and it looks like they're picking 75, which would be a real tragedy. But I guess we recognize older and older blood is less and less suitable for younger and younger people. And at what point, should a Red Cross say no? Has anybody been turned away because of their age or just because of their hemoglobin levels? Well, I haven't been turned away yet for my age because I'm still too young, but I have been turned away for having low hemoglobin ones.
Okay, David's been patiently waiting.
Okay. Hi, David.
Hi. Please tell me again, what type of evidence would you like to see to demonstrate that plasmapheresis or the young blood infusions are acceptable? What test can prove it's okay?
Oh, just measure your temperature and breath CO before and after and see how long the pulse hits you. And
That's pretty simple.
Yeah, that's it.
I'm surprised no one's doing that then. That's so easy.
Well, I don't think they want to know.
Oh, okay.
If they know, they might, if they're in charge, they might have a responsibility to tell people.
Okay,
right?
thank you.
You
Thank
make
you.
somebody CO. I showed the slide of the 20 things in medicine that don't warn people. It's
Okay,
like
thank you.
300,000 people a year get dialysis, and they don't know that their CO goes up a lot every time they get it.
Okay. All right,
When are
thank
we
you.
going to tell them? Right? Well, you can't really do anything about it either. If you get dialysis, your CO is going to go up, but maybe we could do something about it afterwards and help them remove some of what we just may get worse.
Okay, thank you. Thanks, yeah. Mhm.
And again, to measure it, I guess there's different opinions on the RKI, but Walt thinks it's not so good, but you mentioned it. Is it okay in your book?
Yes, I don't need the decimal point. For geeks who want the decimal point, the 10th of a ppm, the Sparrow that was put in the chat is the best available at the price. It does give you a nice app to monitor over time. You can see the trace and download it.
Oh, okay. So you're saying the Sparrow would be the go-to. That's the one to get. Is that what I'm hearing?
Everything has some weaknesses. The weakness of the Sparrow is if your phone isn't on and your app isn't on, you can't see anything except a red or a green flash on the device. I think you can change those levels. It also doesn't have a hydrogen compensated CO. So if you have a lot of hydrogen from gas problems in your digestion, you're not getting the right reading.
Okay, I'm scrolling through. I can't see it in the chat. I thought you said it was in the chat. Would someone please?
Posted the information. Maybe it's under a message from Walt. He put a link in for the RKI, and excuse me, for the Sparrow.
Well, here's a much better meter. Let's see what that says. Gas sensing Sparrow. Thank you, Walt.
Good. Somebody asked a question. Oh, Walt, will inhaled ozone turn CO into CO2? In fact, that I believe is why ozone environmental epidemiology studies, commonly and frustratingly to those who do them, show a positive beneficial effect on mortality and disease. Giving people ozone, whether they inhale it or breathing it in the summer when it's high and the other air pollutants are lower, actually in study after study is associated with less incidence of disease and death. And the question is why? Why would inhaling ozone help anybody, especially people with asthma, right? It turns out when they do controlled studies of ozone in chambers with healthy people, their lungs
Oops, locked up again.
Looks like it.
I just wonder, the hyperbaric oxygen's high pressure, and if you just did 100% oxygen, would that be better? Then you don't force the high pressure. That's
Well,
cheap.
I can tell you from I used to work in the pulse oximeter business, and maybe the partial pressure would make a difference, but carbon monoxide sticks to the hemoglobin much better than oxygen does. That's one of the, bases of carbon monoxide poisoning is that eventually you fill up all the hemoglobin with carbon monoxide and you die. Well, not all of it, but enough to kill you.
Like 15%, are you dead? Something like that.
Yeah, I don't know the number.
And then the ozone, I wouldn't recommend it, but ozone,
Yeah.
some people use it and take a little blood out, hit it with ozone, and then put it back in.
Oh,
And that
that's how they do
fires
it.
up your immune system because you've probably degraded some proteins and things. And I don't know the exact mechanism, but people
But
have done that.
but breathing it is bad though. Is what you're
Breathing
saying.
it to me is it's very bad for your lung tissue. Now, there may be indirect effects that Albert was starting to say may help you empirically. So who knows? But like EPA had an 80 ppb, lowered it to 70, I think, recently.
Wow.
ppb in air. And then
Surprising you could even measure that, isn't it?
yeah, well, with the UV, you can go down 10 ppb pretty, no problem, maybe 5. And then NIST is studying, well, ASTM D22 on air as a D2205 on indoor air quality, and they're studying all the air purifiers, trying to make a standardized test for that, including looking at ozone and all the organics and particles and everything else. And so they think you shouldn't use air ionizers because they typically make 10 ppb ozone, which is not much, but it's added, and they recommend don't use air ionizers.
So Chris is saying I'm doing that. I'm not sure if it's the rectal or the blood. Neither one sounds like a lot of fun. But so I guess you can get it into your blood and, well, I'm not sure what exactly you do.
Blood, you take it out like 100 mils, zap it, and then stick it back in. But you're messing with your blood and all that. Whereas the rectal, some people claim, is actually easier and better and low cost. Do it at home. I mean, the instruments to make the ozone are like $1,000, but it's not FDA approved.
Okay. A cheaper sparrow. Great.
So I'm on a MEM sensor industry group that's making standards for devices for sensing carbon monoxide, things like that. And so I'll recommend to them, see if they could come up with lower cost CO H2 compensated sensors.
Well, the vast majority of people, the H2 makes no difference, right? He mentioned that was for people who have a specific kind of disease where they exhale H2. I don't think most of us do in measurable quantities.
Well, SIBOs, small intestinal bacterial overgrowth,
okay.
You exhale a lot of methane and the hydrogen, and it can vary which of which depending on the situation. And it's not so much it's toxic, but then as far as the monitoring, it interferes with the CO reading because they're both reducing agents. So electrochemical sensor, they're read similarly.
Thanks to Gunther for putting that in because I'm about to buy one. Now I can get it cheaper.
So we need to have sensors on your iWatches and what things.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's really weird. The thing that Albert mentioned about the feds and the state, like in California, you literally cannot buy certain things and bring them into the state because they don't have. They're so hyper concerned about the alarm that they won't. They're not considering people who are actually trying to optimize rather than just find out when they're about to die. It's crazy.
Yeah, the CO alarms are about to die detectors, not I might be screwing up my chronic health.
Yeah, exactly. And there's You see that all the time on like WHO sites and CDC sites. They're very concerned about disaster, but very oblivious to optimization.
Well,
Chris, would you call Albert again? Are you there, Chris? Okay, I'll send him an email.
Oh, he said yes.
Oh, he says yes. Okay.
Yeah. Hey, this has been a great show, Johnny. You managed to get us to stay here for what, 3 hours? My goodness, that's quite a compliment.
Diehards, that means we'll all live to be 150, right?
Well,
that will get hemorrhoids from sitting for too long.
Close to 4 hours counting Steve's thing.
Yeah, I came into that just a little late and I couldn't find it. I don't know what went wrong, but
The other thing, we had more than 33 people.
Yeah.
We had 33 people or more. So that's the highest we've ever been, Johnny.
Well, thanks to Albert for such a draw.
You got me here. And do you guys looking at longevity follow Ranjong Nag, NAG,
yes,
R42?
Well, yeah.
The alumni angel.
Yeah.
Does he ever come to this stuff? Does he attend at all?
Well, I think he occasionally posts. He's a member. Actually,
Okay.
I'm going up there on the 11th, and I'll be speaking to that
Okay.
meeting. Will you be there?
No, I never travel. I got a son with myalgic encephalomyelitis, similar to chronic or long COVID, and so he's bound. So I never travel anymore, and I do everything at home. And virtual saves a lot of very green, very cheap, and I could do 3 times more without having to do traveling.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, one of the great things about what Albert's done here is, and I, from the very first, Chris brought him to my attention, and he has brought to the longevity community the importance of carbon monoxide. You know, all of us here have probably been to dozens of conferences. I never heard a word about it until Albert brought it up. And now I realize it's far more important than many of the things that are brought up.
Yeah. Well, and then CO2 in ambient air starts to change your pH of your blood a little bit and makes you not think as well. It's not lack of oxygen, it's CO2 buildup that affects your pH and other things. So is that a deal? And then nitric oxide. Nitric oxide has endothelial effects, neurotransmitter effects. Nitric oxide is an interesting parameter also.
Looks like a fertile field for study, at least for me.
I'm looking at exhaled breath analysis. I was with Air Liquide for 19 years. They sell gases.
Oh.
And I just consult from home.
Well, Mark, I mean, I meet a lot of people. I don't recall meeting you. Are you on our GRG list or?
No, basically I met via Albert Donnay, who we met via myalgic encephalomyelitis, which is similar to Lyme, chronic Lyme, which I think he had, and then also similar now to long COVID. So I'm very involved with long COVID, exhaled breath analysis, gases, sensors, clean rooms, indoor air quality.
Well, please shoot me an email. I'd like to be able to correspond with you.
What's your email?
Quickest one, jadams, JADAMS @grg.org. And in there, let me know if you'd like to be on our email discussion forum. It's a list service and, it's high quality.
Yeah, very worthy.
And I attend MIT Alumni Angels, Chemical Angel Network. We see 200 pitches a year there, including half our med tech and summer longevity.
You're in San Ramon?
San Ramon, California.
Oh yeah, I used to work over there at EG&G. I don't think they're there anymore.
Yeah, guys, I'm back.
Crow Canyon.
I had to switch computers, but my microphone on that computer was not working, so I'm back here. But we've been going 3 hours, so I think I need to drop off.
Was that Albert? I don't see you on
No,
the
that was
screen.
Chris.
That was,
Oh,
yeah,
Chris, okay.
Albert, I couldn't reach his phone. He didn't answer his phone and his voicemail is full. So I think he's gone.
Well,
All right, I guess I'll leave too. Oh, here he is. Just when you're about to leave.
All right, but I am leaving. See you guys.
big
Thanks,
thanks.
Chris. I'm glad I could make it back and say goodbye, and I hope there's some questions I could still answer. I apologize for losing all my power on both devices and my internet. I don't know what's happening in my community.
Well, I can ask one question, Albert. Is there any orally consumable stuff you can take that will maybe in your intestines will suck carbon monoxide out of your blood? Like activated charcoal seems like something that might do it,
If you put things in your mouth, they shouldn't end up in your blood, right?
No, but they interact in the intestines with your blood.
If you want what the smarty pants at Harvard are working on, they're working on a foam product made with material considered safe. They worked with a food chemist, and they found a way to inject CO into foam so it stays there. And they're trying to make, at first they thought they would make a food product, but then they found that they thought they have a better application. It's going to be anally injected to treat GI disorders. They're going to put a plug of this foam up people's colons and hope for the best. So no, in terms of getting rid of it, the way you get rid of a gas, right? Gas, suck it out. If you want to get the blood fraction out, you'll have a mix of the gas that's in plasma, about 10% is dissolved, and you'll have the higher fraction bound to hemoglobin. So that's pretty effective, but you got to get blood to get it. And that's a big pain in the ass, which is why vacuuming it out, suctioning it out, breathing it out seems much more appropriate. You can also bring it out in water. People who sweat a lot, as I mentioned before, give it off. And all body fluids contain some. So whether you're crying or sweating or peeing, breastfeeding, CO is coming out. It's actually really high in early breast milk.
Would drinking a lot of water tend to purge you of CO?
I don't know. I don't
mean,
know
because you're peeing more.
I don't know. I think the things that make you get rid of CO mostly relate to ventilation. How fast are you breathing? Are you being a couch potato, or are you jogging? Or are you the jogging study from Colorado clearly showed you can counteract a pretty high CO volume around you level, but only as long as you're doing it. As soon as they stop jogging, the level of CO in air went into their lungs again and went back up again. A lot of studies have shown you only get this benefit as long as you're actually doing the jogging or whatever the thing is. So it's easier to stay home and just put a rebreather mask on your face and spare the exercise.
Now, one thing you've mentioned to me that I don't really think you mentioned today was there's certain things you can do that will release CO and cause your blood to have more CO in it and cause your breathe out more CO. Like for instance, red light therapy, right? That will cause a release of CO.
The red light therapy, if it's working right, isn't going into your blood. It's releasing it through your skin.
What do you mean if it's working right? It penetrates through your skin. It penetrates through your skin to some degree.
Yes, but if the CO you're liberating, the idea of liberating CO under red light is not to have it go in a bloodstream and go away somewhere else. The idea is to liberate it to do something there that needs to be done, like healing a wound or stopping pain, which is all done outside of blood, right?
Okay.
The nerves for pain and all the various bits and pieces that are engaged in healing a wound are not actually working blood supply. They hope to restore working blood vessels, and blood vessels is one of the things that CO has been shown to grow. No CO, no growth.
No blood. So if you get the CO out of your skin, then I guess partial pressure would drive it from your blood back into your skin. So actually, you're ultimately sucking it out of your blood as well. Is that correct?
Yeah, if you can start draining it from anywhere, it'll cause a flow in that direction.
Mhm.
Because, again, like water goes downhill, if you can drain it from your blood, the tissues beyond your blood will change the dynamic equilibrium with the blood the next time it comes around. If the blood level is lower, the tissues will go, oh, let's give some up.
Right.
The
It's
problem
like
with
partial
living in
pressure
America,
kind of a thing, right?
exactly. The problem with living in America, since the EPA started this clean air campaign, is that with CO in air now at just 2 parts per million, nobody can keep a higher level in their body. As soon as our organs produce more, out it goes. We used to
Isn't that
have the
good?
backstop. I
Isn't
don't
that
think
good?
so. Well,
I
look
mean,
at the
don't
growth.
most people have too much carbon monoxide in their system? Isn't that a correct statement?
Well, if just longevity is the goal, what did we see from EPA's clean air experiment? A huge boost in longevity for people who live in clean air countries,
Okay.
right? Countries with catalytic converters got a lot of mileage, pardon the pun, out of the longer life expectancy that I think came from lowering ambient CO levels. The only problem was it left everybody completely unprepared for events that require you to have some CO and make more quickly, like a COVID infection. And that's why non-smokers got hit so hard by COVID and smokers didn't get it.
So could I hit myself with a steel bar and increase the CO to prevent some disease?
Well, that's a big part of the people who think CO is only beneficial are doing. They're using CO in many models, especially cancer models, which say that if I can give you the CO before you're exposed to the carcinogen, you reduce your risk. Just like with COVID. If I can have you smoking before you get COVID, exposed to it, you won't get it. But if you get COVID, because I wasn't smoking, so I got it. Once you get it, then giving more CO would be harmful because the body's not ready for it at that point and using it in disease, just as with cancer. It's preventive if you have it high in advance, and it's thought to make the cancer worse and grow it if it comes along later. So, when did you get the carcinogen? We think 40 or 50 years ago with a lot of these. So I don't see a benefit to making, well, I see a lot of harm, and I'm hoping that the benefit comes on the other side when clinicians stop making things worse with what they do. The EPA is not going to reverse the catalytic converter thing, but there are still countries on Earth that didn't do the experiment. Nigeria, most other countries of Central Africa, they didn't do this. And they still have 10 to 20 ppm in air all the time. They have a high rate of respiratory disease, as expected. They have a lower life expectancy, as expected, but they didn't get COVID. They had the lowest rates of COVID in the world. Now, they were also helped by the genetic predisposition. I mentioned that people who are from Africa have a genetic predisposition to a less hyperreactive form, same as smokers get, of this pathway. So they look like smokers from birth, and they just don't overreact, saves their ass in malaria and beta thalassemia reactions, where people from the rest of the world can die just from your autoimmune reaction.
Gunther's been waiting patiently.
Okay.
Yeah.
Oh, did you complete your answer, Albert? Sorry
Yes.
if I thought you were done.
Interrupt me.
My question has to do with your presentation where you showed constriction of the face, that one half of the face appears to be deformed, and I wonder if you could spare a little more details. What exactly is happening anatomically?
There's a muscle from here to here. That muscle gets a palsy and it shortens, pulls the eye down and the mouth up. Looks like that. Right? That muscle, if you want to look it up, is called, I love this name, it's very complicated, zygomaticus minor. ZY, and it gets complicated after that. Minor is MINOR, and there's a major, which is closer in, but this is definitely the minor muscle that's in play here.
But why only one muscle? There has to be on both sides, isn't it?
No, because one side of the face usually gets more CO exposure than the other when the face is getting exposed. So what type of situations have it? I asked, who has it? I happened to notice that some of the US mass murderers, we have a lot of them, they have it. I also noticed that US senators and presidents have it. I didn't think from the same cause. I noticed that autistic children show a lot of it. I hope not from the same cause. But I figured out why the psychopathic mass murderers have it, because they always hold the gun on the same side when they go to the firing range to practice. And all that CO coming out of the cloud of the weapon hits the side of their face that's against the weapon more than the other side.
Wow.
Thank you.
Of course, it also makes people crazy and violent. I'm not making that up. Psychotic behavior is a thing. So to give guns to people with CO poisoning is really stupid. But doctors don't look at this as a sign of CO poisoning and don't see it that way. Not everybody who gets it is a violent murderer, obviously, but many autistic children with it are on that end of the spectrum where they can't control their behavior and their outbursts. And in adults in the US Senate, the reason they have it on one side, and also the television news host, but not the television reporter from the field. The television anchor and the senator always show their best side to the camera, right? Shoot my best side. That's the side that gets the heat of the camera lights. If you've ever been in a studio, you know how hot that is. So they're way overheating this, activating the heme oxygenase over here, but not over here. And that's why you don't see it in the House of Representatives so much. They don't get on television as much as the senators and the presidents.
Well, you'll see that like long distance truckers and so on, their left side gets a lot of sunlight. I wonder if there's any related.
That would be a great
issue
experiment,
there.
right? To see what happens. The sun increases heme oxygenase activity, but it also, at the right wavelengths, if it's light, not heat, allows the CO to come out.
Oh.
That's why a lot of people like morning sunbathing. It's been a thing in Germany for centuries, apparently, because morning sunbathing releases CO without making more. Afternoon sunbathing makes more at the same time. That's why you get red hot and wet in the afternoon, but not the morning.
But wouldn't the sweat also release a lot of CO and that be somewhat compensating?
Well, we were having that debate before. You got to do the math on yourself. Nobody can predict.
Okay.
But that's what I like about this. There's no mumbo jumbo, black box. It's just a number.
While you were away, I mentioned to the crowd here that, really want to congratulate you for bringing this to the attention of the longevity community, because it's really totally underemphasized if you go to the average conference and so on. And so this is a good thing.
Well, thank you. I hope you were able to follow it. You've actually been following it since the beginning. You were one of my inspirations. I should ask that. I love
arguing with you about
it. Well, there are people on the call who never heard this before, who haven't spoken up yet. Can I ask somebody who hasn't said anything yet, if you're hearing this for the first time, are you still on the call because you believe this information, or you're still on the call because you don't believe it? And I wonder why you're still here.
It's engaging. It's a specialty I didn't know about until you came along. So here we are.
Well, thank you. As you see, there is a huge amount of literature for somebody to dive into if they want to learn more about how HO and CO play a role in all of these pathways, whether it's on the senescence side or on the growth and wound repair side. And I hope someday there'll be conferences devoted to endogenous CO and both the benefits and the risks, but there haven't been any since before the pandemic that I'm aware of. I actually went to the first one back in 2000 and in 2000. It was in the World Trade Center in New York.
By the way, Albert, one thing you didn't mention that you have mentioned in the past is that the end tidal fraction of your exhalation is, especially dense in carbon monoxide. And I guess arguably by deliberately exhaling very vigorously, you can thus help clear out excess carbon monoxide. Am I overstating it?
Yeah, you're confusing a few things. It depends. Remember I said with my method, you can now see the CO level in your lungs versus your average of all your other organs and tissues, not counting the arteries and veins, shuttling it back and forth. People with COVID got a much higher level in their lungs because that was the source organ for the insult that triggered the response that made the CO that the blood then carried around and delivered a slightly lower level to every other organ, right? Okay. Whereas somebody with a menstrual cycle, somebody with rheumatoid arthritis, somebody with a broken leg that's healing, a brain injury that's healing, any such other organ beyond the lungs would be pumping out. Think of it like a motel room where you got some people cooking meth, okay? Some people are cooking out a lot more stuff in your body, and those organs that are, they put that out in the hallway and say, you pick up the trash. And it goes around, and some of it ends up in all the other rooms. Just depends where it starts from. So you can't say it's always going to be highest at the lower level fraction, lower lung fraction, which is typically what we think of as the best sample to measure what is delivered by the venous return. To actually measure what's in the lung itself, you don't want just the bottom of the lung, because so many respiratory illnesses are upper respiratory or middle respiratory. And if you exhale that fraction first and lose it, you miss it. So some instruments are fast. They measure in microseconds or milliseconds. They can measure the CO at that rate as you exhale it and see the trace from your mouth to your throat, upper lung, middle lung, lower lung. And it really differs a lot depending on where your pathology is. If you've got a bleeding ulcer in your mouth is going to be the highest. If you have a bleeding lung, punctured lung or something, your lung will be the highest.
But still, it seems like if you're basically in good health, by exhaling that high CO concentration and tidal air, you're doing yourself a favor, maybe not.
Well, you measure it first. Maybe it's not high. I guess that's what I keep saying is I can't commit that your venous return is higher. Sometimes your arterial is higher, or rather your lung is higher than your tissues. If your tissues are higher and it's bringing it back to the lung and you want to get rid of it, yeah, you need to increase your ventilation, which you can do with your cupped hands, pulling your t-shirt over your face, and so on. They'll all make you breathe more and you'll exhale more. And it's a good thing, I think, to get rid of it. Nobody's heard me present this and said, Albert, I still think CO is better than not, and we should all be loading up, right? Pass the joint. Yeah. I'm not sure where the people who don't think about it are going to end up, but certainly the people who do think about it, we don't want a whole lot of CO accumulating in us. And I think the other huge longevity benefit that's not healthy, but it worked, is that where do people in North America spend their time? Inside buildings, out of the sun. Like bats and naked mole rats. They hardly get any sun anymore. Humans never had that. In the history of humans, we never had that. Or if we did, it was a small community somewhere, right? Women under chadors in some parts of the world still, unfortunately, but wherever it is, or burqas, right? Those people who are not getting sun and heat exposure because they live in air-conditioned buildings should live longer just for that reason alone. And it looks like they do. So I'm thinking that we have artificially done a whole lot already to tackle this CO issue in longevity. We lowered it to nothing in air. So everybody has a really low level in their breath now, and as low as possible as we can have in our blood, short of zero. And yet we're seeing health consequences from that we're not happy with, like susceptibility to cancer, susceptibility to infections, even if we like the longevity part, are you willing to pay the price of higher risk of cancer? And here's where we can get creative. Yes, there's that higher risk, but now we know how to mitigate the risk. We could get the higher life expectancy from low CO in air, from living in dark air conditioned buildings. I'm looking through my new installed replacement windows that are such a dark green tint for energy saving that I feel like I got to turn the lights on during a sunny day. But
well, wait a minute. I thought excess CO would actually encourage cancer.
Well, again, if you have it in advance, it's prevented. If you get the cancer, then it's going to grow it, and you'd rather not be overexposed.
Interesting.
Almost all of the pathways where CO is beneficial, it's beneficial in advance. And you can easily design animal experiments where you pick up a rat or a mouse who's never been exposed to anything, but you can't find humans who don't have a life history of exposure to toxins. And you don't know if they have that toxin in them already that's already starting to grow a cancer, in which case giving them more CO will feed it. Versus, oh, you're about to go visit a toxic waste dump next week. Let's give you some CO to protect you before you go over there. One of the best protections and one of the most beautiful ceremonies in history, which existed for thousands of years around the world, where people had smoking ceremonies, was if you had a visitor come to your community, you sat down and smoked a pipe with them. First thing you did. Now, for whatever reason they were doing it, did they know that that was essentially fumigating the lungs of their visitor and also protecting everybody who was going to meet the visitor from transmitting some infection? Either way, it was a great habit.
Quick question about the sparkling water versus still water. Do you think that sparkling water would be then protective against cancer?
No, there's literature though on the heavy water versus the light water. If Bren's still on the phone, can she comment on that? I forget which is which. Heavy water is more common, I believe, in the US in the south and in the coast areas, and light water is more common up by Alaska because apparently it comes in off the ocean and drops the heavy part, and then the moisture part ends up being lighter water that makes it up north. But I'm totally
heavy waters more, well, water has more deuterium in it nearer the tropics and at lower elevations, while you have more towards the poles and also at higher you have more deuterium depleted or less heavy water nearer the poles and at higher elevations. However, there's an effect with UV exposure that mitigates that when you're closer to the equator. So people who actually have sun exposure nearer the equator, even though they're getting more deuterium in their water, their bodies are more able to excrete it and manage it than those who are nearer the poles. However, there's an additional complicating factor in that people who live in the north actually, if they are spending time outside, even though they have such short days, they're getting more UV because of the less of an ozone layer atmospheric protection. So more UV is coming down and helping the body to manage that deuterium. So I have to say, Albert and I are not quite congruent in our understanding and our curiosity about sun exposure. At this time, I'm still learning about the impact of sunlight of the various ranges for helping to manage not only deuterium but other mitochondrial quality control issues.
Well, not to mention vitamin D.
Not to mention, and that's incredibly important. And there are studies that show that getting your vitamin D via sun exposure, that vitamin D is just a proxy for adequate sun exposure, do not achieve the same benefit through a supplement. And in fact, it can oppose the benefit that you would get from the sun otherwise. One other study I wanted to mention real quick, and I'm gonna stop my comments, and that is that there is I can't quote you what study it is, but it's one that was done, I think, in Sweden, intending to show that people that were sun seekers would have a higher cancer rate, and also have a shorter lifespan than people who avoided the sun. What they found, in contrast to what they thought they were going to find, was that the people who were sun seekers actually had a better overall survival and a lower cancer death. They may have had an increase in skin cancer, but they still had better survival even if they had cancer. And if they avoided burning, then that was kind of so. There's a lot of competing things at play here, and I personally think that sun exposure, admittedly better while it's cooler, is really important.
Brandon, if I
adding.
may ask, go ahead.
Yep. I want to comment on the drink question and close that question out because I looked up in my database whether heavy water makes HOCO go up or down. And again, heavy water is water enriched with a low level of deuterium, and that is now sold as a supplement, and it is an HO inducer. It makes it go up. For those of you who want to know about the other liquids on here, coffee.
Well, wait, before you go on, I would hope that the only supplements being sold related to heavy water would be deuterium depleted water, which would be less heavy than tap water. I don't know. Can you clarify what that study was actually using?
Oh, this study was using heavy water for sure, but maybe the consumer products are using depleted. I hear you. I don't know.
Yeah, I'm not aware of someone intentionally increasing their intake of heavy water. There's a whole lot of reasons not to do that, and most of them relate to mitochondrial function. And my physics professor, like 40 years ago, said that they used to joke about writing a murder mystery about, killing somebody with heavy water, but could easily be done.
I hope you all can appreciate how lucky I am to have Bren as my bounce ideas off of partner in life, at least in this work. She's always bringing new stuff to the table and challenging me. So I don't get away with much, if anything, under her. And I'm so glad she clarified these other things about heavy water that I didn't realize. And I could click the link on my own sheet here and see where it takes me to read the reference. But I think more interesting than the fact that heavy water is on here is I just want to mention the other drinks. So if you want to keep track of what you're doing, when you're having coffee, green tea, or milk, your HO1's going up, cow or human milk. And if you're having alcohol, black tea, or any sweetened beverages, sweetened with fructose, stevia, sucrose, etc., they'll make it go down.
Just to be clear, heavy water is unilaterally bad for you, I think. Is that correct?
Well, having elevated heavy water is, to my knowledge, bad.
There's no amount that's good for you, is there?
What?
There's no amount that's good for you.
Well,
I have to say, fools beg to differ.
Evolutionarily, one could make a case that a tiny amount is probably used in some way in the body. For example, species that have really high stress requirements on their bodies. The example I've heard given is like birds that dive into the water for their prey, and suddenly they have that impact on things. And they have their enhancement of the deuterium in the collagen can improve its strength. But so there's a localization. It really matters where it is. And it's like one deuterium molecule control, I forget the number, but many hydrogen, many protons. So I think that there's I expect that we're going to find, and I haven't had time to really research if somebody's done this yet, but I expect we're going to find that there's a role in how deuterium manages how protons gather and compartmentalize in different parts of the body. But that's just a suspicion. So anyway, there is some small role, but you don't want it in your mitochondria at all. I mean, not where the Krebs cycle's happening and the electron transport change. There's actually a lot of there's a pretty strong case that it's made that by Dr. Borosh, Laszlo Borosh, who goes through the fact that many of the processes in the mitochondria are basically main purpose is to exclude deuterium from being brought in to where it could cause havoc. So basically it's checking all it's checking the carbohydrate molecules, hydrogen by hydrogen. It allows the hydrogen in, but it excludes the deuterium. Because if it lets deuterium in, then it causes so many problems. So anyway.
I just checked on Amazon, and it is actually depleted water that's being sold, not
good.
So at least they got that part right. But they're also saying it wouldn't be toxic until you had replaced up to 10% of your water. But either way, not a good idea.
That's not true.
Let's go to the next
That's
question. I
goofy.
think we answered that one. Do you have a follow-up, or did that answer it?
Yeah, no, that answers. I mean, as far as I know, it's almost always bad, except for Ren just pointed out some areas where it might be okay. But you also got to consider when you're getting heavy water, some tiny percent of it is tritium, and that's definitely poisonous.
Yeah, and that's a very tiny percentage.
Yeah. Well, you know.
I have a question for Albert. Heavy carbon, C13 in CO2 or CO, any data?
Oh yeah, excellent research on that. Excellent, I say, because that's the tool they're using to see what happens to CO, and it is with such experiments that people discovered back in the 50s. Nobody believed it. It took about another 50 years before it got accepted that carbon monoxide is being transformed. About 10% of any ingested poisoning ends up as carbon dioxide over the next 2 to 3 days before that pathway dies down again. So there's some relatively slow process that's able to metabolize CO to CO2, which is a good trick.
Using heavy carbon?
Just your body does it. We don't know how. The people who studied it may know how, but this is just what happens to people who get CO poisoning. Some of it we now learn by tracing the labeled version of CO. It comes back out in their breath as carbon dioxide, which means somewhere in their body they were able to transform it.
Well, my question was about isotopic composition. If the carbon monoxide or carbon dioxide contains C13 instead of C12.
Right.
Oh, not naturally. No, not that I know of. This has only been done in research experiments as a way to track the CO. I mean, there may be a small amount in air. I'm not enough of an atmospheric chemist to know, but it's insignificant. And if it were significant, we couldn't be using it as a tracer in research, right?
Well,
Because we don't even have it.
carbon-13 natural abundance is about 1%.
Right. Significant.
Well, I guess not compared to the other 99. So if our natural body width is having 99% C12 and 1% C13, that would be easy enough then to account for in whatever experiment you're doing with it. But in terms of how it does our body react differently, I don't think so. Nobody suggested that you only get the CO2 when you're using C13 CO, and if you use C12 CO, it wouldn't happen. I mean, is that the kind of thing? There might be some quirk of the.
I mean, there's
kinetic
isotope effects very small for carbon-12 versus 13 versus deuterium versus hydrogen's a bigger factor.
Much bigger.
Oh, I follow you. Yeah, so I just don't know the rest of the body's chemistry here. Mostly we're worried about CO binding to iron or copper pockets throughout the body. In researching this, stumbled on the amazing history of the animals like the conch and the nautilus and the horseshoe crab that have been around longer than red blood cell animals, right? Hundreds of millions of years. And they use hemocyanin, a copper-based compound instead of hemoglobin. They don't have red blood cells. They don't have red blood. They have blue blood. And this hemocyanin is always in their bloodstream, floating free and able to carry oxygen. And I learned that those animals who've survived so many upheavals that wiped out red-blooded celled animals that came later, right, that didn't make it, why are horseshoe crabs still here? I think it's because of this quirk of their blood, which, unlike all the hemoglobin animals, their hemocyanin is more attracted to oxygen. All the heme proteins are more attracted to CO. But in those animals, they don't have to worry about CO poisoning. They can't get CO poisoning. CO can't knock off oxygen. Whereas in all the mammals, it's the opposite. What do you guys think of that? Were any of you aware of the way these copper proteins work in those ancestors of, I guess they're not ancestors, they're still here. In the blue-blooded animals? It seems like their longevity is also a thing. They grow slowly. The oxygen doesn't kill them. And they have no biochemistry with CO at all. It's just like we don't care.
Lobsters also have blue blood, and I think they could live to be 100 years, I believe.
So I think that's another point for my theory. If animals without CO en masse live really long, in looking up the history of them, though, I learned that there is another batch of evolution of them, much smaller size animals that appeared only about 50 or 60 million years ago. And the two at the top of the list I'm remembering now are centipedes and millipedes. I did not realize they were blue-blooded either, but the second round of evolution of these things, they're all like that size or smaller. So in terms of growing large and growing long, having a long life, after niches were filled up by mammals, they don't seem to be able to do that as well. But if humans figured out a way to not have CO have priority binding over oxygen, I don't think we could implement it without destroying all the rest of the animal's biology, because I think this is so fundamental to how oxidative stress is managed. But maybe there's a creative genetic hacker at some lab who's going to make some version of a mouse or a rat that uses hemocyanin instead of hemoglobin, and they live 100 years.
Well, thanks everybody. I got to get going. See y'all soon.
Me too.
I'm going to say goodbye at 4:30. Thank you all.
Thank you, Albert.
And you too, Johnny. Great work.
Thanks, Johnny, for hosting me.
All right, bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Yeah, big thanks.
I
I'll
will
have
put
it up
up,
on the YouTube channel sometime soon.
Great. And I will send a link for the slides to the list for the people who met it when I put them up tomorrow.
Great. Thank you.
Okay.
Well done.
Bye.
Outstanding.
Thank you.
Thank you.